She pressed both hands flat against her chest, fingers curling into the faded cotton of her dress, trying to hold herself together, the way a person holds broken glass. Carefully, desperately terrified that one wrong move would send everything scattering across the platform floor, and she would never find all the pieces again. The letters were still in her bag. 6 months of letters. 6 months of a man's careful handwriting promising her a home, a life, a place in this world where her size would never once be mentioned, where she would finally be chosen, truly, completely, without condition or apology. And Thomas Reed had not come. If this story moves something inside you, please subscribe to our channel and follow Charlotte's journey all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from, because I want to see how far this story travels. The afternoon train had pulled into Harlow Creek, Wyoming, exactly 14 minutes behind schedule, and those 14 minutes had felt to Charlotte Whitmore like 14 separate lifetimes, each one more suffocating than the last. She had stood at the window of the passenger car, with her forehead nearly touching the glass, watching the landscape flatten into dusty open plain, watching the wooden buildings of a small frontier town emerge from the heat shimmer on the horizon. And she had told herself what she had been telling herself for 6 months, that this was the beginning of something real. That a man who wrote the way Thomas Reed wrote, with such careful attention, such deliberate warmth, such specific and unhurried tenderness, that kind of man did not disappear. That kind of man showed up. She had believed that completely. Until the train stopped and the passengers stepped down and the platform filled with people meeting people, husbands, opening arms for wives, fathers, lifting children, neighbors, shaking hands, until every single piece of that reunion puzzle clicked into place around her. And she was the one piece left on the table, the one that didn't belong to any picture. She waited 20 minutes on the platform before she allowed herself to sit. She waited another 40 before she stopped watching the street for a tall man with light brown hair and the kind of broad shoulders Thomas had described in his third letter, the one that arrived on a Tuesday in February when the snow outside her mother's house in Ohio was coming down so hard she couldn't see the fence at the end of the yard. She had read that letter 4 times. She had pressed it flat against her chest the way she pressed her hands there now. She had thought, this is the one, finally. The wooden trunk beside her held everything she owned. 2 dresses, both of them old. A pair of leather shoes resold twice by the same cobbler who never once charged her full price because he felt sorry for her, which she had always pretended not to notice. A small tin box containing the letters themselves bundled with a length of brown ribbon she had cut from an old bonnet. A Bible that had belonged to her grandmother. $41 in paper money folded inside the Bible's back cover, every cent she had saved over 3 years of keeping books for her uncle's dry goods store in Columbus. $41 and the clothes on her back, and 6 months of letters promising a life in Wyoming. That was the entire sum of Charlotte Whitmore at 25 years old. She heard them before she fully registered that she was being watched. A cluster of women near the feed store across the dusty street fanning themselves against the summer heat, speaking in that particular low register that carries farther than people intend when they're enjoying themselves too much to be careful. Charlotte caught individual words the way you catch pieces of a conversation, through a closed door, enough to understand the shape of what was being said without needing every syllable. Thomas Reed's mail order came all the way from Ohio. Can you imagine thinking he'd actually... Lord, look at the size of her. A sound like laughter quickly swallowed. Charlotte kept her eyes on the street. She had been hearing variations of that particular laughter her entire life. She knew its texture by now, the way it caught in people's throats when they wanted to seem polite, while being something far from it. She had learned as a girl to hold her chin level when she heard it. She had learned as a young woman to breathe slowly and deliberately, to keep her hands still, to give no visible sign that the words had found their mark. She was very good at that now. She did not cry. She simply sat on her trunk in the hammering afternoon sun of a town she did not know, in a state she had never visited before today, waiting for a man who was not coming, while strangers across the street assessed her body and found it wanting, and she held herself together with both hands and breathed. A shadow crossed her. She looked up. A man had stopped his horse directly in front of the platform, not dramatically, not with any apparent intention of being noticed, but simply stopped the way a man stops when something requires him to stop. He was tall in the saddle, broad across the shoulders, wearing a dark vest over a worn linen shirt, with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. His hat was brown dust-colored, pushed back slightly on his head. His face was weathered and serious, the kind of face that had spent years outdoors without much concern for what the sun was doing to it. He was looking at the women across the street. Not at Charlotte. At the women who were laughing. His expression did not change exactly, but something shifted behind his eyes, a tightening. A recognition, the brief visible passage of a man deciding something. He stepped down from the horse, tied the reins to the platform post with 2 practiced loops, removed his hat, and walked toward her, and Charlotte straightened without meaning to. Old reflex. Something in the deliberate approach of a stranger made every muscle in her body arrange itself into whatever posture was least likely to invite comment. He stopped a respectful distance away. 6 feet, maybe 7. Far enough that she didn't need to tilt her head back to see him. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low. Not soft exactly, but quiet in the way that things are quiet when they don't need to be loud to be heard. Charlotte looked at him directly. She had learned that too. Looking directly at people, not letting her gaze skitter away, not giving them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. "Sir," she said. He turned the hat once in his hands, a slow rotation. A man thinking about his next words before he said them. "Do you have somewhere to go tonight?" It was the most direct question anyone had asked her in months. No preamble, no throat clearing, no polite fiction about whether she was perhaps waiting for someone who was simply delayed. Just the question that mattered, asked plainly. Charlotte considered lying. She was good at that, too, at constructing small, dignified fictions to place between herself and other people's pity. She had said, "I'm perfectly fine," so many times in her life that the phrase had worn itself smooth like a river stone. But something about the directness of the question and the way he was looking at her, not through her, not past her, not at the parts of her that made women across the street cover their mouths, stopped her. "No," she said. The word came out smaller than she intended. She straightened again, correcting for it. "No, sir, I do not." He nodded once, slowly, as if her answer confirmed something he had already suspected and had already decided how to respond to. "Harlow Creek's got 1 boarding house," he said. "Mrs. Aldridge runs it. She's fair-priced, and she doesn't ask a lot of questions." A pause. "I can walk you there if you want. It's 2 streets over." Charlotte studied him. She had been in enough situations in her life where a man's apparent kindness was actually the opening move of something she didn't want to participate in. She had learned to look for the calculation behind the offer, the angle the thing being sought in return. She looked for it now. She didn't find it. His face was simply patient. The way a man's face is patient when he has nowhere to be for a few minutes and no particular investment in whether you said yes or no. "Why?" she asked. He blinked once. Slight surprise, maybe, that she'd asked outright. "Because you've been sitting here a while," he said. "And because it's going to be dark in a few hours. And because the Harlow Creek platform is not a good place for a woman to spend the night alone." He glanced once briefly in the direction of the women across the street. "Or the evening, for that matter." Charlotte followed his glance. The women had gone quieter now, watching the exchange with open curiosity. She looked back at him. "I don't know you," she said. "No, ma'am, you don't." He put his hat back on his head, adjusted the brim. "Name's Nathaniel Callahan. I run the Callahan Ranch about 4 miles east of here. I come into town Fridays for supplies." He tilted his head slightly. "I'm not going to give you a reason to be sorry you talked to me. I can promise you that much." It was not a grand declaration. He didn't say it the way men in novels said things with their chests full of it. He said it the way you say something you've thought about enough to believe, and don't feel the need to ornament. Charlotte stood up. Her legs were stiff from 2 hours on the trunk in the heat, and she was aware, as she was always aware when she stood in proximity to someone new, of the particular way she occupied space. The fullness of it, the amount of room she required, the way her dress settled around her when she moved. She waited for his expression to shift. It didn't. He moved to her trunk without being asked, picked up one end of it. "You want to get the other side?" he said. She got the other side. They carried it together the 2 streets to Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house, and Nathaniel Callahan did not make a single comment about her size, her situation, or the fact that a man named Thomas Reed had apparently left her sitting alone on a train platform in the Wyoming heat for the better part of an afternoon. He simply carried his end of the trunk. Mrs. Aldridge was a compact woman in her 60s, with a sharp face and a sharper mind, and she took in Charlotte's situation with one long look and 2 seconds of silence before she named a fair weekly rate and showed her upstairs to a room with a window facing east. Nathaniel waited in the front hallway with his hat in his hands. When Charlotte came back down, because she had not known what else to do, and because something about going upstairs and closing the door on the first person who had been genuinely decent to her felt wrong. He was still there. "You'll want to eat something," he said. "Millie's place on the main street has decent food, and she's not the type to make a person feel like they owe her conversation." Charlotte almost smiled. Almost. "You seem to have thought this through," she said. "I just know the town," he said, "and I know the people in it." The way he said it was careful, not unkind, but honest in the way that things are honest when someone isn't trying to protect you from the truth, just presenting it at a useful angle. Some of them are good, some of them take a while, and some of them— another brief glance toward the street— aren't worth spending energy on. "The women at the feed store," Charlotte said. He didn't look away. "Yes, ma'am. They knew," she said. "Didn't they?" It wasn't quite a question. Nathaniel Callahan was quiet for a moment, turning his hat once in his hands. "I think," he said carefully, "that some people in this town knew something about Thomas Reed's situation that you didn't." "His situation?" she repeated. "Yes, ma'am." "What situation?" He looked at her steadily. Deciding again, she could see it, deciding how much to say and how to say it. "I don't think you should hear that from me," he said finally. "I think you should hear it from someone who knows the particulars better than I do. But I'll say this, what happened to you today was not your fault. And it was not—" He stopped, started again. "It was not the result of anything that is wrong with you." Charlotte felt something move through her chest. A strange sensation, almost physical, like a door being pushed against from the wrong side, pressure building at the seams. She did not want to cry in front of this man. She looked at the wall above his left shoulder and breathed. "Thank you for the trunk," she said. "And for Mrs. Aldridge." "Of course." He put his hat back on his head, moved toward the door. "Mr. Callahan." He stopped. "Why did you stop?" she asked. "At the platform. You didn't have to." He stood with his hand on the doorframe, not looking back at her fully, just partly the way a man looks when the answer to a question is something he doesn't usually say out loud. "My mother," he said. "She was left alone in a place she didn't know once. Long time ago. I was 12. Nobody helped her." A beat. "I thought about that a lot over the years." He pushed the door open. "Evening, ma'am. You sleep well." The door closed behind him. Charlotte stood in Mrs. Aldridge's hallway for a long time after that, listening to the sound of his horse moving away down the street, and she thought about a 12-year-old boy who had watched his mother be abandoned in a place she didn't know, and who had apparently spent the next 23 years ready to make it right for someone else. She thought, "I don't know this man." She thought, "But I think I might know what he's made of." The dining room at Millie's was half full when Charlotte arrived, and the woman behind the counter, Millie herself, apparently a broad-armed woman with gray-streaked hair and flour on both elbows, pointed her to a corner table without ceremony, and brought her a bowl of beef stew and a piece of cornbread, before Charlotte had fully sat down. "You're the woman from the train," Millie said. Not unkindly, just directly. "Yes," Charlotte said. "Reed stood you up." Apparently. Millie made a sound that was somewhere between a sigh and a word that the more refined women of the town would have found unsuitable for mixed company. "That man," she said. She put her hands on her hips and looked at Charlotte with the frank assessment of someone who had seen considerable amounts of human behavior and formed strong opinions about most of it. "You want more cornbread, you just ask." It was perhaps the smallest act of kindness Charlotte had received all day, and it nearly undid her. "Thank you," she managed. Millie went back to her counter. Charlotte ate slowly, methodically listening to the conversations around her with half her attention and spending the other half on the careful internal accounting she had been conducting since the train pulled away from the Columbus station 3 days ago, the mental ledger of what she had, what she'd spent, what she'd lost, and what remained. Assets $41. A room at Mrs. Aldridge's. The clothes on her back. 3 years of experience keeping books for her uncle's store. The ability to add long columns of figures in her head without error, which her uncle had called a peculiar talent, and which her mother had called a waste since it was keeping Charlotte at a desk when she should have been making herself agreeable to eligible men. Liabilities, everything else. She was 25 years old, obese, in a century that had very particular and relentless opinions about that unmarried, in a culture that had even stronger opinions about that. Sitting alone in a Wyoming town where she knew exactly one person who was a cowboy she had met 45 minutes ago who had carried her trunk and said 8 or 10 decent sentences and ridden away. She had 72 hours, she calculated, before her savings would start to show strain. 3 days to find some form of income or work or arrangement that would allow her to remain somewhere that was not the street. She had been in worse positions. Hadn't she? She thought about this seriously, finishing the stew, turning her spoon in the bowl. No, she decided. She had not. But she had been in positions that felt worse and had walked out of all of them, and that had to count for something. Nathaniel Callahan could not entirely account for why he came back the next morning. He told himself it was town business. He had forgotten to pick up a parcel at the post office, which was true and which would have brought him back to Harlow Creek regardless. He told himself he stopped at Mrs. Aldridge's simply to check that the woman had settled in without incident, which was the kind of thing a decent person did when they'd personally escorted a stranger to her lodgings. He did not tell himself the truth, which was that he had thought about her for most of the previous night, not with any romantic or complicated intent, but with a persistent, low-level concern that felt like a stone in a boot. Something that needed addressing before a man could walk right. She was already up when he arrived. Sitting in Mrs. Aldridge's small front parlor, with a ledger book open on the table in front of her, a cup of tea cooling at her elbow, working through what appeared to be Mrs. Aldridge's household accounts, with the focused attention of someone who had found a problem they knew how to solve. Mrs. Aldridge was sitting across from her watching this with an expression of considerable surprise. "You've been carrying this wrong for 2 years," Charlotte was saying. "The supply costs for the kitchen should come off the operating line, not the maintenance line. It's changing your quarterly picture entirely." She pointed to something in the ledger. "Look here, and here. Your actual profit is, well, it's better than you thought. By a fair amount." Mrs. Aldridge looked at the ledger, the way a person looks at something they've been afraid of for a long time and have now been informed is actually manageable. "My husband used to do the accounts," she said. "When he passed, I just kept doing what I thought he'd been doing." "He had a different system," Charlotte said, not unkindly. "It's an older method. It works, but it doesn't give you a clear picture of where you actually stand." She turned a page. "Do you mind if I go back through the last year? I can reorganize this so you can read it yourself going forward. It won't take me long." Nathaniel stood in the doorway for a moment before either of them noticed him. He watched Charlotte lean over the ledger, running her finger down a column of figures with total absorption, explaining something quietly to the older woman, and he thought she's doing this because she needs to be useful, because sitting still feels dangerous to her. because doing something concrete in the face of a situation she can't control is how she keeps herself from breaking. He recognized that particular mechanism. He had built his whole life around it. "Mr. Callahan," Charlotte said without looking up. "Mrs. Aldridge's kitchen window faces east. If you're going to stand in the doorway, the light's behind you." He stepped inside. "Morning, ma'am." She looked up then. The dark circles under her eyes told him she hadn't slept much, but her voice was steady, and her back was straight, and she was looking at him with the same direct assessment she'd given him on the platform. "I'm helping Mrs. Aldridge with her accounts," Charlotte said, "in partial exchange for a reduction on next week's room rate, which she's been kind enough to agree to." She glanced at Mrs. Aldridge, who nodded. "I'm also going to need more work than that. Do you happen to know whether any businesses in town need bookkeeping?" "Harlow Creek's got 6 businesses that need bookkeeping, and none of them do it properly," Nathaniel said, which was the honest answer. "Walt's Feed and Supply has been running his numbers wrong since I've known him. The hotel on 2nd Street doesn't keep accounts at all, far as I can tell. And the bank, well, the bank is its own problem." Charlotte was looking at him with an attention that felt like being measured for something. "The bank," she said. "What kind of problem?" Nathaniel pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Mrs. Aldridge quietly took herself to the kitchen. "There's a man named Harlan Doss," he said. "Runs the Harlow Creek Territorial Bank. He's been in town about 3 years. Since he arrived, 4 ranches have gone under. Small places, family operations that had been running fine for 20 years. He put his hat on the table. "The way it happens is the same each time. Ranch hits a hard season, drought sickness, and the cattle a bad winter. Ranch owner goes to the bank for a loan. Doss gives them the loan, but the terms aren't what they agreed to verbally. The paperwork's different. The ranch owner signs because they're desperate and because they trust a man in a bank. Then 6 months later, the bank calls the loan early, the ranch can't pay, and Doss takes the property." Charlotte was very still. "Do the ranch owners have copies of the agreements?" "Some of them." "And are the terms on the paperwork different from what they verbally agreed to?" "That's what they say." "Can they prove it?" "That," Nathaniel said, "is what nobody's been able to figure out." Charlotte looked at the ledger in front of her, then at the window, then back at him. "You're not just telling me about the town's accounting situation," she said. "No, ma'am. You're telling me about this because you think I might be able to help." He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, just considering his words. "I'm telling you because you asked what kind of problem the bank was," he said, "and because I don't see any reason to answer a direct question with something less than the truth." Charlotte picked up her pen, put it back down, clasped her hands on the table, and looked at him directly. "Mr. Callahan, I arrived in this town yesterday with $41, no employment, no acquaintances, and no plan beyond the one that failed. I'm sitting here this morning because I have approximately 72 hours before my financial situation becomes critical, and reorganizing Mrs. Aldridge's ledger is the only concrete action available to me." A pause. "I am very good with numbers. I have been keeping accounts since I was 16 years old, and I have never once failed to find the error in a set of books, regardless of how carefully that error had been buried." Another pause, shorter. "If someone in this town has been falsifying loan documents, I will find it. That's not a brag. It's just what I do." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. "My ranch," he said, "is one of the ones with a Doss loan." The words landed quietly in the room. Charlotte heard them. She heard what was behind them, the particular tone of a man stating a fact that has been sitting on him for a long time, wearing him down, in the specific way that financial fear wears on a person who built something with their hands and is watching it be slowly taken from them through means he can't quite see clearly enough to fight. "Tell me the terms of your loan," she said. "The verbal ones. What did Doss promise you?" 3 years at 6%, balloon payment at end of term. "And what does the signed document say?" "I assumed it said the same thing." "Do you have it?" "Back at the ranch." "When can I see it?" Nathaniel studied her face, looking for something she didn't know what. Doubt, maybe, or the particular expression people wore when they were performing capability they didn't actually possess. He didn't find it. "I could ride out and get it this morning," he said. Or, Charlotte said, "You could take me with you." The silence in the room had a different quality now. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "I understand that's unconventional," she said. "I understand what people in this town will say. I've heard what people in this town say, and I assure you, I've heard worse, and from people I cared more about." She kept her voice level and her hands still. "I'm not suggesting anything improper. I'm suggesting that you have a problem with your financial documents. And I have a skill set that addresses exactly that problem, and that Mrs. Aldridge has already agreed to vouch for my character, should anyone ask, and that the sooner I see those documents, the sooner we both know what you're actually dealing with." Nathaniel Callahan picked up his hat from the table. He turned it once in his hands. "You finish your tea," he said. "I'll get the wagon." The Callahan Ranch was 4 miles east of town, as he'd said, and Charlotte spent the ride watching the land with the focused attention of someone categorizing information rather than admiring scenery. She noticed how the grass ran, the fence lines which were in good repair and which weren't, the condition of the cattle she could see in the eastern field, the state of the barn roof, the way the main house sat on its foundation. She was building a picture. "Your cattle look healthy," she said. "They are," Nathaniel said. "That's not the problem." "What is?" "The supply prices Doss arranged through his contacts are running 40% above what I was paying before, and the loans pulling against the operation every month. What's left over isn't enough to make improvements. So the place is standing still while everything around it costs more." He kept his eyes on the road. A ranch that stands still dies slowly. "How long have you had it?" 14 years. Bought the land when I was 21. Built the house the first year myself." A beat. "My father helped with the barn." "Your father's not—" "Passed, 8 years ago." Charlotte looked at the fence line going past them. "I'm sorry," she said. "He was a good man," Nathaniel said. "Straightforward, honest to a fault." A pause. "Said the measure of a man was what he did when nobody was watching." Charlotte thought of the platform, of a crowd of watching women and a cowboy who almost kept riding. She thought he learned that lesson. He learned it well. The house was simple and solid the way things are simple and solid when they've been built by someone who wanted them to last. Charlotte walked through it without comment, noting what she noticed: the order of it, the cleanliness, the absence of anything decorative, the presence of everything functional. A man who had been living alone for some time. The documents were in a wooden box on the desk in the front room, a desk that was otherwise covered with supply invoices, cattle records, weather notes, and several months' worth of correspondence that had clearly been opened and stacked in the rough order of arrival, but never properly organized. Charlotte sat down at the desk. She pulled the loan documents from the box. She read them. She read them a second time more slowly. Then she looked up at Nathaniel, who was standing near the window with his arms crossed watching her. "Your verbal agreement was 3 years at 6%, she said. "Balloon payment at term end." "Yes." "This document says 18 months at 9.5%. Balloon payment callable at lender's discretion." She put the papers flat on the desk. "With a penalty clause that allows the bank to accelerate the full balance if you miss a single monthly payment by more than 5 days. The room was very quiet. Nathaniel stood perfectly still. "Those are not the terms I agreed to," he said. "I know." Charlotte laid the document beside a clean sheet of paper from his desk and began copying figures. "And I need you to think carefully. When you signed this, did you read it fully? Or did Doss walk you through it verbally, and you signed based on what he told you?" A long silence. "He talked me through it," Nathaniel said. His voice was different now, lower and controlled in the way that voices go controlled when a man is keeping his anger on a short rein. "Sat across the desk from me and said the terms clear as I'm standing here. I had the number in my head, 6%, 3 years. I signed where he put the pen." "And you trusted him?" "I had no reason not to." He moved away from the window, stopped at the edge of the desk. "I'm not a fool, Miss Whitmore. "I know that," she said calmly. "A fool doesn't keep records like these." She indicated the supply invoices. "May I look at those?" He nodded. She pulled the invoices toward her and began going through them methodically, her pen moving steadily across the blank sheet figures accumulating in neat columns. Nathaniel watched her work. After a while, he pulled the second chair to the other side of the desk and sat, because standing while she worked felt wrong in some way. He didn't analyze too carefully. He picked up a piece of the correspondence she'd moved aside and noticed it was a letter from one of the other ranchers, a man named Beaumont who'd lost his spread to the bank 6 months ago. He put it back on the pile. "These supply prices," Charlotte said without looking up. "Your arrangement with the suppliers, did Doss recommend them, or did you have existing relationships?" "Doss recommended them, said they were the most reliable in the territory. They're overcharging you by 43% on grain, 38% on feed supplement, and 61% on fencing material." She turned a page. "Those aren't market fluctuations. That's a consistent, structured markup." She looked up. "He's taking a cut. The suppliers are Doss's contacts, and he's arranged kickbacks from every sale." Nathaniel's jaw was tight. "Can you prove it?" "Not yet," she said. "But I can show pattern. If the other ranchers with Doss loans are paying the same inflated prices to the same suppliers, that's not coincidence. That's a system." She laid down her pen, looked at him squarely. "Do you have contact information for the Beaumont family and the others who lost their ranches?" "I can get it." "Get it," she said. "And I'll need to speak with each of them about their loan documents and their supply arrangements." She picked up the pen again. "Harlan Doss has been running a fraud, Mr. Callahan. Not a clever one, actually. It just looks clever because nobody sat down with the numbers and added them up in the right order." A pause. "I'm going to add them up in the right order." He looked at her for a long moment, at this woman who had arrived in his town 24 hours ago with a trunk and a bundle of letters and a situation that would have flattened most people, who was sitting at his dead father's desk with ink on her fingers, going through his accounts like she was doing something as straightforward and necessary as breathing. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I'm not going to be able to pay you much." "You're going to pay me 30% of what you recover from the bank when we're done," she said. "And you're going to give me use of this desk and that chair until the work is finished. And you're going to tell Mrs. Aldridge that I'll be coming out here regularly so she doesn't think anything unsuitable is happening." She met his eyes. "Is that agreeable?" He almost smiled. The corner of his mouth moved in a direction that was adjacent to a smile. "That's agreeable," he said. Outside, the summer afternoon was hammering the Wyoming plain with all the indifferent force it had been. Hammering it with all day, but Charlotte Whitmore didn't notice, because she had a set of falsified documents in front of her and a fraudulent banker to dismantle and exactly enough room at this desk to do the work. She turned to the next page of invoices. She began to add, and for the first time since the train had pulled into Harlow Creek Station, she was not thinking about Thomas Reed at all. The first thing Charlotte did the following morning was make a list. Not because she needed to, the numbers were already organized in her head with the same natural precision that other people organized words or melodies, but because a list made visible on paper was a tool she could hand to someone else, and she was going to need other people before this was finished. She sat at Mrs. Aldridge's small writing table before the sun fully cleared the eastern hills, working by lamplight with the careful efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that the early morning hours before the town woke and began its opinions about her belonged entirely to her. She wrote down every figure she had copied from Nathaniel's documents the previous afternoon. She wrote the vendor names, the markup percentages, the dates, the loan terms as written versus the loan terms as Nathaniel had verbally described them. Then she looked at what she had written. She looked at it for a long time. What she was seeing was not an accident. It was not sloppy bookkeeping or honest error. What she was seeing was architecture of fraud built in careful layers, each one designed to look like ordinary business from the outside while functioning as a systematic extraction from the inside. Harlan Doss had arranged it so that each individual piece appeared justifiable. The loan terms were in the signed document, not Doss's fault, if the borrower hadn't read carefully. The supply vendors were legitimate businesses, not Doss's fault if their prices were high. The penalty clauses were standard banking language, not Doss's fault if the borrower couldn't meet the payments. But when you laid all the pieces beside each other, when you looked at the structure rather than the individual components, what emerged was a machine designed to do one thing: transfer land from ranchers to the bank. Charlotte put down her pen. She thought about Thomas Reed. She hadn't thought about him much since yesterday afternoon at Nathaniel's desk, and the realization that she'd managed 24 hours without the particular sick weight of that humiliation settling over her felt like something worth noting. Not celebrating exactly, just noting. She picked her pen back up. She had work to do. Nathaniel arrived at Mrs. Aldridge's at 7 in the morning with a wagon and a piece of paper containing the names and locations of 3 families: the Beaumonts, the Pierces, and a widow named Greta Holt, who had lost her 40-acre spread to the bank the previous winter and was now living with her daughter on the south edge of town. He stood in the hallway with his hat in his hands while Charlotte read the list. "Greta Holt is in town," Charlotte said. "Let's start with her. She's not—" He paused. "She's had a hard time of it, since the bank took the land. She's not always ready to talk about it," Charlotte finished. "Yes. I know what it's like to have something taken from you and not be ready to talk about it," Charlotte said, folding the list and putting it in her coat pocket. "I'll be careful with her." He studied her face a moment. Then he nodded and stepped aside from the door. Greta Holt was 61 years old and looked when she came to her daughter's door like a woman who had recently survived something and was not yet entirely certain she was glad about it. She was thin in the way people get thin when grief and worry replace meals with white hair she hadn't fully pinned, and eyes that went cautious the moment she saw Charlotte standing beside Nathaniel Callahan on the front step. "Mr. Callahan," she said. "Mrs. Holt." He removed his hat. "This is Miss Charlotte Whitmore. She's a bookkeeper. She's been looking at some of the bank's loan arrangements, and she'd like to ask you a few questions about yours if you're willing." Greta looked at Charlotte. Charlotte looked back at her steadily. "I know how this feels," Charlotte said quietly. "Being asked to go back through something you're trying to stop thinking about. If you want to say no, I understand that completely." She paused. "But I think Harlan Doss did to you what he's done to others. And I think if you can tell me what your original loan terms were, what he said to you, not what the papers say, it might be possible to prove it." Greta Holt was quiet for a long moment. Then she opened the door wider. "You want coffee?" she asked. They had coffee. They talked for an hour and a half. And by the time Charlotte left, she had 3 more pages of notes and a very clear picture of exactly how Harlan Doss had taken the Holt Ranch, the same verbal terms, the same document discrepancy, the same carefully arranged supply vendors, with their same inflated prices, and the particular way Greta's voice had thinned out when she described signing those papers, how she'd trusted him because he was the bank, and because her husband had just died. And because she'd been so frightened, she hadn't thought clearly, hadn't thought to read every line, had trusted that a man behind a banker's desk in a proper suit was not looking at a 60-year-old widow and calculating exactly how long it would take to take everything she'd spent 40 years building. Charlotte sat in the wagon on the way back to Nathaniel's ranch and did not speak for a while. Nathaniel didn't push her. That was something she was beginning to notice about him, the way he understood that silence wasn't a problem to be solved. He drove with one hand loose on the reins and let the miles pass without filling them, which was a rarer quality in a person than most people seem to realize. "She signed because she was scared," Charlotte said finally. "Yes," Nathaniel said, "and because he counted on that. He chose his targets deliberately. People in hard seasons, people who'd had a loss, people who needed the loan badly enough that walking away wasn't a real option." She turned the notes over in her hands. "He's very good at reading desperation." "You think he did the same thing with Reed?" The name landed in the air between them. Charlotte felt it a small internal flinch quickly controlled. "What do you mean?" "Thomas Reed." Nathaniel kept his eyes on the road. "He came to Doss for a loan about 2 years ago when his ranch was struggling. Got it, lost the ranch inside of 6 months. Everything he had gone. He paused. After that, he changed. Became, I don't know the right word for it. Meanness is too simple. More like someone who decided if he was going to get taken, he'd start doing the taking. Charlotte was very still. "The mail order arrangement," she said. "It started about a year ago, far as anyone knows. Writing to women in the East. I don't know all the details." His voice was level, careful. "But I know Doss broke him first." She thought about this. She thought about a man sitting down to write careful, tender letters to a woman in Ohio, calculating her desperation the way Doss had calculated Greta Holt's. She thought about her own handwriting and her responses, the way she had let herself believe each word he wrote. Something clarified in her chest. Not forgiveness, she wasn't ready to call it that, but something adjacent to understanding, which was worse in some ways and more useful in others. "Doss broke him," she said slowly, "and Reed decided to do it to someone else." She paused. "That's not an excuse." "No," Nathaniel said. "It's not. But it's information." She put the notes in her coat pocket. "Doss is the root. Reed is what happens downstream." They drove the rest of the way to the ranch in silence, and Charlotte thought about roots and what grew from them, and the way damage moved through people and communities, like water moving through rock, slowly, invisibly, until one day the rock cracked in a place you hadn't expected. She was going to find the root. She was going to pull it out. The desk in Nathaniel's front room became hers by the end of the second day, in a way that neither of them discussed or acknowledged, but both clearly understood. She came each morning, and he drove her. She worked while he ran the ranch, coming in at noon for the meal he cooked without fanfare, and left on the table without announcement. Simple food, always the same unhurried quality, the kind of meal that said, "I knew you'd need to eat, and I did something about it without making it a production." She tried to thank him on the third day, and he looked at her with such uncomplicated steadiness that she stopped mid-sentence. "You're working," he said. "Working people eat lunch. That's not generosity, Miss Whitmore, that's just sense." She ate her lunch and went back to the accounts. By the end of the first week, she had spoken with all three families. Nathaniel had reviewed photocopies of their loan documents alongside the hand-recorded notes of what each family remembered being told verbally, and had built a clear and detailed picture of Harlan Doss's methodology. The pattern was identical in every case. Verbal terms that sounded reasonable. Signed documents with materially different terms. Supply vendors with markups that followed the same mathematical formula, as if Doss had a predetermined percentage he calculated per transaction. Penalty clauses structured to be triggered by the kind of seasonal cash flow interruptions that any Wyoming rancher might experience once a decade. It was meticulous, it was thorough, and it was going to take more than her personal analysis to do anything about it. She needed a lawyer. That was when the problem of Harlow Creek made itself fully apparent to her. She had understood in an abstract way that a small frontier town in 1884 Wyoming was not a place that offered many resources for a woman trying to pursue a legal case against the town's only bank. She had understood this the way you understand things before they're real to you intellectually, without the full weight of the actual obstacle. The actual obstacle arrived in the form of a man named Calhoun Price. Calhoun Price was Harlow Creek's one attorney, a thin-shouldered man in his late 40s who operated out of a small office between the barber and the post office on Main Street. Charlotte had made an appointment. She had brought her notes. She had sat across his desk and presented the case methodically, walking him through the discrepancies, the pattern, the mathematical evidence of the supply markups. He had listened with his hands folded on his desk, and the careful expression of a man who was thinking about something other than what was being said to him. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Is it?" "Yes." "You arrived in Harlow Creek, I understand, less than 2 weeks ago." "That's correct." "And before that you were in Ohio, was it?" "Columbus, Ohio. I kept accounts for my uncle's dry goods business for 3 years. He unfolded his hands and refolded them in the opposite configuration. "That's very interesting. And I can see you've done a considerable amount of work here." He glanced at her notes without picking them up. The difficulty, you understand, is that Harlan Doss is an established member of this community. He's been here 3 years. He's a member of the church. He sponsors the July 4th celebration. A brief pause. And what you're describing is a very serious allegation. Fraud, deliberate falsification of documents. Yes, Charlotte said. That's what I'm describing, because that's what the documents show. Based on your analysis. Based on the documents themselves. The documents show what they show regardless of who reads them. Price looked at her for a long moment, with the particular expression of a man who has decided something but would prefer not to say it directly. Miss Whitmore, he said carefully, even if what you're suggesting is accurate, and I want to be clear that I'm not in any way dismissing your work, the practicality of bringing a case against a bank on behalf of clients who signed the documents they signed, based largely on their recollection of a verbal conversation that is an extremely difficult legal proposition. A pause. In this territory, with these resources. In other words, Charlotte said, you don't want to take the case. Price's expression went slightly pained. I want to be realistic with you. In other words, Charlotte said again calmly, you know Harlan Doss, you do business in this town, and taking a case against him would make your life considerably more complicated than it already is. And you've decided that this woman who arrived 2 weeks ago from Ohio isn't going to be here long enough to make your refusal a problem for you. The pause that followed was long enough to confirm it. Charlotte picked up her notes. She stood. Thank you for your time, she said. She walked out of Calhoun Price's office into the bright Wyoming afternoon, and she stood on the sidewalk for a moment with her jaw set and her hands quiet and her mind already moving to the next possibility. Behind her, through the glass of the law office window, she could see Price reaching for his telephone. She thought he's calling Doss. She thought I have very little time. She walked quickly to the post office. She had a letter to write. Nathaniel found her that evening at the desk in his front room, writing with the concentrated urgency of someone racing a clock they could feel but not see. He had been in the south field most of the day repairing a stretch of fencing, and he came in with the particular tired quality of a man who had done hard physical work under a summer sun and had earned it completely. He looked at her and knew something had happened. Price refused, he said. Price refused and called Doss the moment I left his office, Charlotte said without looking up. So Doss now knows I've been compiling this documentation, which means he's either going to start preparing a defense or he's going to do something to prevent the case from ever being made, and I don't know which one yet, but I need to move faster than either possibility. She finished the sentence she was writing and looked up. I'm writing to a law firm in Cheyenne. I have a reference a man my uncle did business with once. It's a long shot, but it's the best shot I have. Nathaniel sat down in the chair he'd taken to occupying across from her, the one that had been pushed there sometime on day 2 and had stayed there. What does faster look like? He said. I need copies of all the documents, all 5 families. I need them organized in a format that a lawyer who's never been to Harlow Creek can understand completely without asking me a single clarifying question. She turned back to the letter. And I need them soon. Doss is going to move. Move how? I don't know yet. She finished the letter and set it aside to dry. But he's been running this for 3 years, and nobody has ever sat down with all the documents at the same time before. He won't like that someone has. She looked at Nathaniel steadily. I need you to know if this becomes uncomfortable for you. If Doss approaches you, makes a threat, tries to call your loan early. He's welcome to try, Nathaniel said. His voice was very even. I'm serious. Your position here is more exposed than mine because you actually live here and have... Miss Whitmore. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, looking at her with the direct, uncomplicated honesty that she was beginning to understand was simply how he was built. This ranch has been in my family for 14 years. My father helped me build that barn. I have cattle out there that I raised from calves. I have... He stopped, started again quieter. I have nothing behind me and nothing coming that matters more than keeping what's mine. And what Doss took from Greta Holt and the Beaumonts and the Pierces, He stopped again. Those were people I knew. People who worked hard and didn't deserve it. His jaw tightened. So you don't need to ask me if I'm comfortable with the exposure. I've been angry about this for 2 years and just didn't have a way at it. Charlotte looked at him. She thought about what he'd said about his mother, about a 12-year-old boy watching a woman be abandoned and deciding something in that moment that he'd been carrying ever since. She thought he doesn't just step in for strangers. He steps in for anyone standing where he once saw his mother stand. All right, she said. She picked up her pen. Then let's work. The threat came on a Thursday morning 10 days after Charlotte had arrived in Harlow Creek. She was alone at the ranch Nathaniel had ridden to the Beaumont property to collect the original copies of their loan documents which Charlotte needed for the packet to the Cheyenne attorneys. She had the front room organized into careful sectors. Callahan documents on the left side of the desk. Holt on the right. Beaumont and Pierce in 2 stacks on the table behind her, the working copy of her analysis in the center. She heard the horse before she heard the knock. Then the knock, 3 solid impacts on the doorframe. The kind of knocking that is a statement before anyone opens the door. She considered not answering. She answered. Harlan Doss was a man of about 50 with a prosperous build and the particular smooth confidence of someone who had spent years having rooms defer to him when he walked into them. He was wearing a good suit considerably finer than anything else Charlotte had seen in Harlow Creek. He removed his hat when she opened the door, which was a courtesy gesture so practiced it meant nothing. He looked at her. Then his eyes moved past her to the desk. He took in the organized stacks of documents with one long controlled look, and Charlotte watched his face carefully, the slight alteration that moved through his expression when he saw what she had assembled the way a man's face shifts when he realizes the situation is larger than he'd been told. He looked back at her. "Miss Whitmore," he said pleasantly. "I don't believe we've been formally introduced. Harlan Doss, Harlow Creek Territorial Bank." "I know who you are," Charlotte said. She did not step back from the door to invite him in. She did not smile. "I wonder if you might have a few minutes," he said. "I'd like to speak with you." "I'm busy," she said, "as you can see." He glanced past her at the desk again. Something moved in his eyes, something controlled, careful, the particular look of a man recalculating. "I understand you've been meeting with some of our bank's clients," he said, "going over their loan documentation." "I have." "And that you visited Calhoun Price's office last week." "I did." "And that you've sent correspondence to attorneys in Cheyenne." That one landed differently. He'd intercepted her letter, or Price had told him the details. Either way he knew. She kept her expression exactly as it was. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and his voice dropped slightly, became quieter and more personal in the manner of a man who is about to say something he wants to feel like a private exchange rather than a threat. "I think there may be some misunderstanding about the nature of the bank's loan agreements. These are legal documents signed by consenting adults. If there are questions about the terms, there's a very simple process for raising them through proper channels." "The proper channels," Charlotte said. "Such as Calhoun Price." A pause. "For example," Doss said. "Who called you the same afternoon I left his office?" Charlotte said. "And who had a very interesting conversation with you, I'm sure, about what I'd shown him." Doss looked at her with an expression that was almost admiring. Almost. "You're a very direct woman," he said. "I'm a very clear woman," she said. "What I do is add numbers and read documents, and the numbers I've added, and the documents I've read, tell a very specific story about your business practices over the last 3 years. You can call them misunderstandings if you like. The mathematics don't care what you call them." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, the pleasantness was still there on the surface, but underneath it was something harder. A door closing. "Mr. Callahan has a loan with the bank," he said. "It comes due for review in 60 days. I'd hate for there to be any complications with that review, given that the ranch's records are, well, I'm sure you've had a chance to look at them. The cash position is not strong." Charlotte did not blink. "Are you threatening Mr. Callahan's loan?" "I'm noting a fact," Doss said pleasantly. 60 days is not a long time when a ranch's finances are under pressure. Any additional strain, legal involvement, reputational concerns, could make that review quite difficult. A pause. I imagine Mr. Callahan values his ranch. His father built the barn, I believe. He knew about the barn. She thought he's been watching this property. He's been watching Nathaniel. He chose this ranch deliberately the same way he chose all of them. Found the person who had the most to lose, the deepest attachment, the hardest thing to walk away from. She looked at Harlan Doss's smooth, confident face and felt something move through her that was not quite rage. It was colder than rage, steadier, more useful. I'll tell Mr. Callahan you stopped by, she said. She closed the door. She stood behind the closed door for exactly 3 seconds, counting her breaths. Then she went back to the desk, sat down, and began writing faster. She was halfway through the second page when she heard the writer come in at a gallop. Nathaniel back earlier than she'd expected, and when he came through the door with the Beaumont documents under his arm, he took one look at her face and put the papers down. What happened? He said. She told him, all of it precise and complete, not softening the barn comment because he needed to know exactly what had been said. He stood very still through the whole account. When she finished, the room was quiet except for the papers shifting slightly in the draft from the open door. He's going to call the loan early, Nathaniel said. He's going to try, Charlotte said, which means we need the Cheyenne attorneys to respond before 60 days. And we need to add your ranch to the filing immediately, because the moment he moves on your loan, he's demonstrated the pattern in real time. That's the best possible evidence of retaliation, and retaliation establishes intent. Nathaniel pulled the chair out from across the desk and sat down heavily. He looked at the stacks of documents, at the analysis spread across the center of the desk, at the letter half written on the top of the pile. He looked like a man calculating how much he stood to lose. Charlotte watched him. She had never been good at waiting for other people to decide things. Her instinct was to move to press to keep building momentum, because momentum was the thing that kept you from falling when the ground wasn't stable. But something about Nathaniel made her wait. Something about the quality of his silence, the way it was genuine thought, rather than avoidance, made her patient in a way she rarely was. He looked up. My father's name was Thomas Callahan, he said. He filed on this land in 1865 before I was born. He built the first structure out of nothing, just himself and 2 other men in a Wyoming winter. He handed it to me when I was 21 and told me he didn't care what happened to him as long as the land stayed in the family. He paused. He's buried on the east side near the fence line he built first. I know, Charlotte said quietly. He looked at her. I noticed the marker my second day here, she said. I didn't say anything because it wasn't my place. Nathaniel was quiet for another moment. Then he reached across the desk and picked up his pen. Tell me what to sign, he said. Charlotte had almost smiled at that, almost, when the sound of wagon wheels outside made them both look up, and the knock that followed on the open door frame revealed something that changed the temperature of the room entirely. It was Walt Greer, who owned the feed and supply on Main Street, who had never spoken a single word to Charlotte in the 10 days since she'd arrived in Harlow Creek, and who was now standing in Nathaniel Callahan's doorway with his hat in both hands, and an expression that contained, in roughly equal parts, embarrassment, and something that looked like it was working itself toward courage. Mr. Callahan, he said. He looked briefly at Charlotte. Miss. A beat. I heard Doss was out here this morning. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair. News travels fast. Town's small. Walt's hands worked the brim of his hat. I need to tell you something, and I need to tell it to... He looked at Charlotte again, the specific look of a man who has been holding something and has decided to put it down. I need to tell it to whoever's been putting together those documents. Charlotte set down her pen. Mr. Greer, she said, sit down. He sat. What Walt Greer told them over the next 40 minutes was this: he had been receiving a monthly payment from Harlan Doss for 3 years, deposited quietly into a secondary account at the bank itself, in exchange for charging Doss's referred customers his highest markup prices and reporting back to Doss if any of those customers began asking questions about their invoices. He had not, he said, understood at first what the arrangement was for. He had understood later and had kept taking the payments because he had debts of his own, and because Doss had been very clear in the particular way that men like Doss are clear without ever saying anything that could be quoted back to them, that Walt's own financial arrangements with the bank would become complicated if the payments stopped. He had also, he said, been at the train station 12 days ago when Charlotte arrived, and he had stood with the women who laughed, and he had laughed too, and he had not slept well since. He said that last part to the floor. Charlotte thought about laughing women and the particular weight of being the person they were laughing at. She thought about how easy it was to stand with the crowd. She thought about the difference between the people who stood with the crowd and the people who didn't. She thought about a cowboy who almost kept writing. "Mr. Greer," she said, "are you willing to make a sworn statement about the payment arrangement with Doss?" "Yes, ma'am," he said, still to the floor. "Are you willing to provide the bank deposit records?" "Got them here." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded envelope. Charlotte opened the envelope. She looked at the records. She looked at Nathaniel. For the first time since she'd opened Nathaniel's loan documents at this desk and seen what was in them, she allowed herself to feel something that was adjacent to certainty. "Well," she said. She set the records carefully in the center of the desk between the Callahan documents on the left and the Holt documents on the right. "Mr. Greer," she said, "thank you for coming." He nodded, stood, put his hat back on. At the door he paused. "Miss Whitmore," he said. He didn't quite look at her, but the words came out with the particular effortful quality of something a person has rehearsed. "What they said at the station, those women, what they said about you." A pause. "It wasn't right. Wasn't any of it right." Charlotte looked at him steadily. "No," she said. "It wasn't." He left. Nathaniel was watching her. She picked up her pen and the half-finished letter and began writing again, folding Walt Greer's deposit records into the pages as supporting documentation, because the attorneys in Cheyenne were going to need everything, and the clock that Doss had just started by threatening the loan review was running, and she did not have time to feel things right now. She would feel things later. There was a great deal she was going to feel later. Right now, she had 70 pages of documentation to organize a letter to finish, and a banker who had spent 3 years taking what wasn't his, who had now made the tactical error of walking up to Nathaniel Callahan's door and mentioning his father's barn. Charlotte Whitmore did not forgive that kind of error. She added it to the case. She kept writing. And at the far edge of her awareness, beneath the figures and the legal language and the sharp, urgent focus of the work, she was conscious of Nathaniel Callahan sitting 3 feet away from her in the chair that had become his. Not saying anything, not asking for anything, just present in the steady, uncomplicated way that he was always present, and she thought without looking up, "I don't know what to do with this man." She thought, "I don't know what to do with someone who just stays." She had not. She realized had a great deal of experience with that. She finished the paragraph she was writing. She turned the page. She kept going. The letter from Cheyenne arrived on a Tuesday, 17 days after Charlotte had sent hers. She was at Nathaniel's desk when Mrs. Aldridge's youngest boarder came running up the ranch road, with it having been paid 2 cents by Charlotte the previous week to bring any correspondence directly to her, rather than leaving it at the house in town. She had known, with the particular low-level certainty that sits beneath conscious thought, that whatever came back from Cheyenne would need to be opened somewhere private, somewhere she could react to it without the town watching. She slit the envelope with Nathaniel's letter knife. She read it standing up. Behind her, Nathaniel came in from the yard and stopped when he saw her face. "Good or bad?" he said. Charlotte set the letter flat on the desk. "His name is Edmund Hale," she said. "He's a senior partner at Hale & Associates in Cheyenne. He says he's familiar with Harlan Doss." She paused. "By reputation." Nathaniel crossed the room and picked up the letter. He read it. "He's seen this before," Nathaniel said. "Not here. But the same structure, yes. Doss operated in 3 other territories before Wyoming, according to Hale. Two of those cases were settled privately, meaning Doss paid enough to make the families go quiet. One went to court, and the documentation was lost before trial. She looked at Nathaniel directly. Hale believes the documentation was deliberately destroyed. The room was very quiet. He's moving here Friday, Nathaniel said, still reading. He's coming to Harlow Creek Friday. He wants to review everything in person before we make any official filing. Charlotte took the letter back. Which means Doss has until Friday to do something, because the moment Hale arrives in this town with a Cheyenne law firm behind him, the situation changes. It becomes something Doss can't contain locally. How would Doss know Hale is coming? He may not, Charlotte said. But I have to assume he's watching. He's been watching since he came to this door. She folded the letter and put it inside the Bible in her bag, the same Bible that had carried her $41 across 3 states. We need to tell the Holts, the Beaumonts, and the Pierces that the attorney is coming. They need to be prepared to meet him, and they need to keep that information inside their households until Friday. I'll ride out today, Nathaniel said. And the documents? She turned back to the desk. Everything needs to be in final order, organized by case chronologically within each case, with the supporting vendor records cross-referenced. She was already moving papers. I'm going to work through tonight if I have to. You haven't slept properly in 4 days, Nathaniel said. She looked at him. I know that, she said. I'll sleep Saturday. He looked at her for a long moment, with the specific expression she'd come to recognize, the one where he was deciding whether to push back or let it go, and then he picked up his hat. I'll have food on the table at noon, he said. Whether you stop for it or not is your choice. He walked out. Charlotte turned back to the desk and got to work. She did not stop at noon. He left the food on the table, and she ate it cold at 2 in the afternoon, without sitting down reading through her own analysis with one hand and holding the cornbread with the other, looking for gaps. Looking for the places where her logic required an assumption rather than a documented fact, because Edmund Hale was going to find every one of those places, and she needed to find them first. She found 3. She fixed 2 of them with additional cross-referencing from the vendor records Walt Greer had provided. The third gap, the most significant one, was the question of when exactly Doss had altered the loan documents. The documents themselves showed the fraudulent terms, but what Charlotte couldn't prove from the existing evidence was whether the alteration had happened before signing, meaning the borrowers had signed a falsified document, or whether some other mechanism was involved. This mattered legally because the defense strategy would be different depending on the answer, and because without resolving it, a clever attorney could argue that the borrowers had simply misremembered or misunderstood the verbal terms, and the signed document was what it was. She sat with this problem for most of Wednesday afternoon, turning it over, looking at it from different angles, and she was still sitting with it when Nathaniel came back from the Beaumont property at 4 o'clock and found her staring at the wall above the desk. You've got that look, he said. What look? The one where the numbers don't add up yet. She looked at him. You've known me 3 weeks. Long enough, he said, and sat down. Tell me. She told him about the gap. She explained it carefully, walking him through the legal implication, why it mattered, what it would allow Doss's defense to argue. Nathaniel listened the way he always listened, without interrupting, without performing comprehension. He didn't have asking one precise question when she finished. What would prove the documents were altered before signing? A copy, she said. A copy of what the document said before the final version was printed. A draft, or a witness who was in the room when the terms were discussed and can testify to what was said. She paused. Or a pattern of identical alterations across all 5 loans that is so mathematically precise it could not have resulted from 5 separate misunderstandings. You have that third one, Nathaniel said. Don't you? I have it, she said. But it's circumstantial. What's not circumstantial? Charlotte put down her pen. A copy of the original draft documents, she said. If Doss kept drafts, and a man this methodical keeps drafts, I'd stake everything on that they'd be at the bank, in his office, in a file or a safe. She looked at the window, which I obviously cannot access. The room was quiet. I can, Nathaniel said. She looked at him fast. No, she said. Doss has called my loan into 60-day review, Nathaniel said. I have every legitimate reason to walk into that bank and request a meeting about my account. It's my legal right. He can't refuse it without raising questions. He was watching her steadily. When a borrower requests a loan review meeting, the banker pulls the file. The whole file. The originals. You're not suggesting... I'm suggesting I look at what's in that file, he said, with my own eyes, in a meeting that I'm entirely entitled to request. A pause. I'm not suggesting I take anything. What you're describing is still legal, he said. Every bit of it. A man has the right to examine documents pertaining to his own account. Charlotte pressed both hands flat on the desk. She thought about it carefully. She thought about Edmund Hale arriving Friday, and what he would need, and what she could and couldn't give him without this peace. She thought about Greta Holt, and 40 years of her life signed away at a desk, while she was too frightened to read every line. She thought about the barn that Thomas Callahan had built with 2 other men in a Wyoming winter. If Doss gets suspicious, she said, if he thinks you're looking for something specific, I won't be looking for something specific, Nathaniel said. I'll be a worried rancher asking about his loan terms, which is exactly what I am. She looked at him for a long time. Thursday, she said. Go Thursday morning. Hale arrives Friday. If you find anything, bring me every detail, not the document, just what you saw, exactly what you saw, and I'll work from that. All right, he said. Nathaniel? He had stood up to leave. He stopped. If Doss tries to pressure you in that meeting, she said, if he makes another threat, I've been handling difficult men since I was 17 years old, he said. I'll be fine. He walked out. Charlotte turned back to the desk. She thought, I believe him. She thought that's a strange thing, to simply believe someone. Thursday arrived with the particular sharp clarity of late summer mornings in Wyoming, and Charlotte spent the first 2 hours of it finishing the final organization of the document packet, and then sitting very still at the desk, unable to do anything useful, which was its own particular form of agony. Nathaniel left for town at 7:30. He hadn't come back by 10. By 10:30, Charlotte was standing at the front window, not quite watching the road, which was the same as watching the road, but allowed her to tell herself she wasn't. At 11:15, she heard the horse. He came in and removed his hat and sat down in his chair across the desk, and she waited. He's keeping 2 sets of files, Nathaniel said. The air went out of the room. Tell me, Charlotte said. The file he pulled for the meeting had the loan documents, the signed copies, the ones with the altered terms. But when he went to the back office for 5 minutes to get some additional paperwork, he stopped. There's a cabinet behind his desk. The drawer was slightly open. I could see tabs, and one of the tabs said, Originals. Charlotte's hands were very still on the desk. He has the original drafts, she said, in a cabinet behind his desk, in a drawer marked Originals. Did you see inside the drawer? No, just the tab. Charlotte stood up, sat back down, stood up again. He keeps them, she said, more to herself than to Nathaniel. Of course he keeps them. He's too careful to destroy them. He'd want them if something went wrong, if he needed to demonstrate a paper trail, if he needed to prove the borrowers signed willingly. He'd want the ability to control the narrative from multiple angles. She turned. He keeps the originals because they're his insurance. His insurance, or the evidence that destroys him, Nathaniel said. Both, Charlotte said, depending on who gets to them first. They looked at each other. The meeting, Charlotte said. How did he seem? Careful, Nathaniel said. He was pleasant in that way he's pleasant, but something was different. He asked me twice if I was working with anyone on my financial situation. Said it in different ways, asked if I'd consulted anyone, then later asked if I'd gotten any outside advice. He paused. He was trying to find out if I was still in contact with you. What did you tell him? Nothing he could use. Said I'd been thinking about the numbers on my own. A pause. I don't think he believed me. Charlotte thought about the drawer marked originals. She thought about Edmund Hale arriving tomorrow. She thought about 60 days that were now 53. There's no legal way to get into that drawer, she said. No, Nathaniel said. And without what's in that drawer, Hale has a strong circumstantial case, but not an airtight one. Yes, so we go with what we have, she said, and we trust that Hale is good enough to make it work, and we do not do anything that gives Doss grounds to have us arrested or the case thrown out on procedural grounds. She sat back down, because that's exactly what he'd want us to do. Nathaniel nodded once. Charlotte picked up her pen, and then the second knock came. Not dramatic, just a knock, but the timing of it 2 minutes after Nathaniel had returned, as if whoever was outside had been waiting for him to arrive, made every muscle in Charlotte's body sharpen to attention. Nathaniel went to the door. The man standing on the other side of it was young 20 at most, with the particular look of someone who had been hurrying and was trying not to show it. He was one of the Pierce boys, the eldest, who worked at the telegraph office on the weekends. "Mr. Callahan," he said. His eyes went to Charlotte over Nathaniel's shoulder. "And you, ma'am. There's a telegram." He held out a folded paper. "Came in this morning, and Mr. Giddings told me to deliver it personally. Said it was important." Nathaniel took it, read it, handed it to Charlotte. The telegram was addressed to Edmund Hale, care of Charlotte Whitmore, Harlow Creek, Wyoming. It had been rerouted from Hale's Cheyenne office. It said in the economical language of telegrams, "Cannot make Friday. Delayed in Denver. Earliest available Cheyenne arrival Monday. Advise on client status. Hale." Charlotte read it twice. She folded it. She thought 4 more days. 4 more days where Doss knows something is happening, and we are sitting in the open with every document that could destroy him organized on a desk in a ranch 4 miles from town. She thought, he's not going to wait. She looked at the Pierce boy. "Thank you," she said. "Did anyone see you bring this out here?" He thought about it. "Mr. Giddings knew where I was going." "And Mr. Giddings, is he a man who keeps his business to himself?" A pause. "He's friendly with Mr. Doss," the boy said carefully. "They eat lunch together most Fridays." Nathaniel's jaw went tight. Charlotte folded the telegram a second time and slipped it into her pocket. "Go straight home," she told the boy. "Don't stop at the telegraph office, and don't mention where you've been." She looked at him steadily. "Can you do that?" "Yes, ma'am," he said. He looked at both of them for a moment, with the particular expression of a young person who has just understood that he is on the edge of something larger than he realized. Then he turned and ran. Charlotte stood in the doorway after he left, not moving, running through the new situation with the same methodical precision she applied to columns of figures, identifying the variables, calculating the risks, locating the critical path. Doss would know by end of business today probably that Hale had been delayed, which meant he would know that Charlotte had 4 more days alone with the documents before any legal protection arrived from Cheyenne, which meant those 4 days were the window he would use. "We need to move the documents," she said. Nathaniel was already thinking the same thing. She could see it on his face. "Where?" he said, she thought. Not the boarding house Doss knew she lived there. Not the ranch Doss had already been here once and knew the layout. Not the Beaumonts or the Holts, they were already exposed. "The church," she said. Nathaniel looked at her. "Reverend Miller," she said. "He's not friendly with Doss. I asked Mrs. Aldridge about him the first week. He's been here longer than Doss. He lost a parishioner to the bank foreclosure and blamed himself for not seeing it, and Mrs. Aldridge says he's an honest man." "He is," Nathaniel said. "Does he have a safe or a locked room?" "His study has a locked door. I know because I helped him fix the lock last spring." "Will he help?" Nathaniel picked up his hat. "There's one way to find out," he said. They spent the next 3 hours moving. Not quickly attracted attention, but steadily, methodically packing the organized document bundles into the plain wooden boxes that Nathaniel used for supply runs to town. the kind of boxes nobody looked twice at in the back of a ranch wagon. They drove to town at a normal pace. They pulled up behind the church. Reverend Miller was a large, slow-moving man with an unhurried manner that Charlotte had initially mistaken for incuriosity and had since recalibrated as the particular stillness of a person who listened deeply. He listened to Nathaniel explain the situation without interrupting. He looked at Charlotte once during the explanation, a long assessing look that she met directly. When Nathaniel finished, the Reverend was quiet for a moment. "Doss has been to 3 services this year," he said. "Always sits in the front pew, always shakes my hand afterward." A pause. "Always leaves before I get to speak to the Beaumont family." He stood up. "My study door locks from the inside and the outside. The documents can stay there until your lawyer arrives." Charlotte exhaled. It came out shaky, which surprised her. She hadn't realized how tightly she'd been holding herself until the holding loosened. "Thank you, Reverend," she said. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly." "Of course." "Are you safe?" he said. "Personally, are you in danger?" She thought about Doss on the doorstep, the smooth pleasantness, and the thing underneath it. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I think he'd prefer a legal method of stopping this. I think he's still calculating whether I can be discouraged or bought off." "And can you be—" She met his eyes. "No," she said. He nodded once. "Then you and Mr. Callahan will also eat supper here tonight," he said, in the tone of a man who has made a decision and considers the matter settled. "My wife will not hear otherwise." They ate supper at the Reverend's table with his wife, a quiet, capable woman, who asked no questions, and refilled everyone's plates without being asked. And Charlotte sat in the modest warmth of that kitchen, and felt something she didn't quite have a name for. The unfamiliar sensation of being in a room where people were not measuring her, not watching her size or her situation, or her unmarried state, just sitting at a table and eating. She was tired enough that it nearly broke her open. She held it together. She always held it together. It was when they were walking back to the wagon afterward, the town quiet around them, and the summer stars enormous overhead, that Nathaniel stopped. Just stopped in the middle of the road and turned to her. "Charlotte," he said. He had never used her first name before, not once in 3 weeks. She stopped. She waited. He took his hat off, turned it once in his hands, that gesture she had come to know so well, the one that meant he was choosing his words with the same care he chose everything. "When this is over," he said, "when Hale gets here and the case is filed and Doss is dealt with." He stopped. "I want to say something that I've been holding back because the timing's been wrong. There's never been a right moment. And I'm starting to think there isn't going to be a right moment, and I should just say it." Charlotte looked at him. The street was very quiet. "You came here," he said, "in a situation that would have broken most people I know. And you didn't break. You sat down at my desk, and you went to work, and you found something I'd given up on finding." He looked at the hat in his hands. "And somewhere in the middle of all of it, He stopped again. "I need to tell you that this ranch, when you're in it, doesn't feel the way it's felt for the last 8 years, and I don't know exactly what to do with that." The stars overhead were very bright. Charlotte stood in the road, looking at this man who had stopped his horse on a train platform because he had promised himself something at age 12, and who had carried his father's land for 14 years, and who cooked lunch without making it a production, and who sat across a desk from her every day, being simply steadily present in a way she had not known a person could be. She thought, "I do not know what to do with this either." She said, "Nathaniel." And then the sound of horses fast coming from the direction of the bank. 3 riders, moving with deliberate speed down the empty street. Nathaniel stepped in front of her before she had fully processed the sound. Not dramatically, no grand gesture, no declaration. Just stepped forward between her and the direction of the sound, with the flat, unhurried efficiency of a man who has assessed a situation and taken a position. The riders slowed. The one in front was not Doss. A hired man, Charlotte recognized the type, the rough utility of it. The man had an authority to his posture that wasn't natural, was borrowed, came from someone else's power, and the envelope likely in his coat pocket. He stopped the horse 6 feet away. He looked at Nathaniel. Then he reached into his coat. Charlotte's hand went to Nathaniel's arm. The man produced an envelope. "Mr. Callahan," he said. "From Mr. Doss, legal notice." He held it out. Nathaniel took it without moving from where he stood. He opened it without urgency, read it, and his face did the thing it did when he was holding something very close, not expressionless exactly, but controlled in a way that cost him something. He handed it to Charlotte. She read it. Harlan Doss was calling the Callahan Ranch loan in full. Not in 60 days, not at review, immediately. For cause, citing a clause buried in the penalty provisions, a clause that said the lender could demand immediate repayment if the borrower was found to be engaged in activities contrary to the bank's business interests. Contrary to the bank's business interests. Charlotte read that phrase twice. She looked at the hired man. "This is retaliatory," she said. "And you can tell Mr. Doss that the retaliatory nature of this notice will be the first exhibit in our filing with Hale and Associates of Cheyenne when they arrive Monday morning." The hired man's expression flickered. "We were told to wait for a response," he said. "You have one," Charlotte said. "Monday morning, Hale and Associates. That's Mr. Doss's response." She looked at him steadily. "Good evening." The man held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned his horse. The three riders moved back down the street. Charlotte and Nathaniel stood in the road until the sound of hooves faded. Then Charlotte turned and looked at him, and this time the thing she had been holding, the thing that had been pressing at the back of her chest for 3 weeks, the weight of all of it, the exhaustion and the fear she hadn't let herself feel, and the particular loneliness of carrying something enormous while not letting anyone see the weight of it. This time, it moved toward the surface, and she felt her eyes fill and blinked hard and breathed. Nathaniel saw it. He didn't say anything. He did not rush to fill the silence with reassurance. He did not tell her it was going to be fine because he couldn't know that yet, and they both knew it. He simply reached out and very carefully put his hand over hers. Just that. His hand over hers, warm and calloused and steady, in the middle of a Wyoming road under stars too bright to look at directly. Charlotte breathed. In. Out. She did not pull her hand away. "He's desperate," she said finally, her voice even. "Desperate men make mistakes. He's just made one by putting that clause in writing." "Yes," Nathaniel said. "Monday," she said. "Monday," he agreed. His hand stayed where it was. She let it. And somewhere across town, in the locked study of a reverend's house, 70 pages of documented fraud sat in a wooden box, waiting for an attorney from Cheyenne, while the man who had built the architecture of that fraud sat in his bank and felt for the first time in 3 years the ground beginning to shift beneath him in a direction he had not planned for. He had accounted for many things. He had not accounted for a woman who arrived with nothing, sat down at a dead man's desk, and decided that was enough. Edmund Hale arrived on the Monday morning train at 11:47, and Charlotte was on the platform to meet him, not because she needed the dramatic gesture of it, because she had not slept more than 4 hours in 3 days, and she needed to be moving, or she would stop. And stopping felt dangerous right now, the way it feels dangerous to let a fire go low when the night is still cold. She recognized him before he stepped off the car. He was the kind of man who arrived places the way weather arrived, not loudly, but with the immediate sense that the atmosphere had shifted, and you had better pay attention. He was in his 50s, lean with gray at his temples, and the particular precise quality of someone who spent his life reading documents and had developed over decades the ability to assess a situation in the same way he read a contract, looking for what the language was doing rather than what it said on the surface. He saw her and came directly over. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Hale." She shook his hand. "I have everything at the church. Reverend Miller's study. I didn't want it at the ranch or the boarding house after the notice Thursday night." Hale's eyes sharpened. "What notice?" Doss called the Callahan loan in full on Thursday, citing a conduct clause. Retaliatory clearly, but in writing, which I've added to the filing packet as Exhibit 7. Hale looked at her for a moment. "He put it in writing," he said. He was frightened, Charlotte said. Frightened men stop being careful. Something moved through Hale's expression, a quick recalibration, the look of a man revising his assessment of a situation upward. "All right," he said. "Take me to the church." They spent 4 hours in the Reverend's study. Hale read everything, not skimming, not sampling, but reading every page with the focused completeness of a man who understood that the details were where cases were won or lost. He asked Charlotte questions precise and rapid, and she answered them the same way, and Nathaniel sat in the corner with his hat on his knee and followed the exchange with the concentrated attention of someone who may not understand every legal term, but understood perfectly well what was at stake. At the 2-hour mark, Hale put down the Holt documents and looked at Charlotte across the table. "The gap," he said. "The question of when the documents were altered. You know about it. I flagged it in my analysis, page 31. It's the weak point. I know that. Without the original drafts, a competent defense will argue misremembering. The verbal testimony is consistent. Every family says the same terms, but verbal testimony against a signed document is a difficult wall." "I know that too," Charlotte said. "But the mathematical pattern of the alterations should carry weight. The same specific changes, the same penalty clause language, the same vendor arrangement 5 times across 5 separate transactions. That's not coincidence." "It's not," Hale agreed. "But it's not airtight." He looked at Nathaniel. "You said you saw a file drawer marked originals." "Yes, sir," Nathaniel said. "We can subpoena it," Hale said. "Once we file, we can compel production of all bank records. If those originals exist and show what we think they show, that's your airtight." He paused. "But Doss will move to resist the subpoena. It'll take time. And in the meantime, the loan call on your ranch stands." The room was quiet for a moment. "How long?" Nathaniel asked. "To get a court order for the subpoena and have it executed 3 weeks minimum. A month more likely." Hale looked at both of them. "Can the ranch operate for a month under a called loan?" Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "I have reserves," he said. "Not much, but some." A pause. "Enough." Charlotte looked at him. She knew his finances better than anyone except Nathaniel himself, and she knew that enough was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. She said nothing. "Then we file today," Hale said, "and we move fast." He began stacking the documents into the careful order Charlotte had organized them in. "I want to speak with each family this afternoon, and I want to speak with Walt Greer. His testimony about the payment arrangement is potentially the most important piece you have. It establishes Doss's intent rather than just the outcome." "I'll arrange it," Charlotte said. "One more thing." Hale looked at her directly. "Doss is going to respond to the filing. He's going to respond through Price probably, and Price is going to make a motion to have the case dismissed on the grounds that you, Miss Whitmore, are not a party to any of the loan agreements in question, and therefore have no standing to compile or present this evidence." Charlotte had known this was coming. She had known it since the afternoon in Price's office when she'd watched him reach for the telephone. "What does that mean for the case?" she said. "It means the case proceeds regardless because the families themselves are the plaintiffs, not you. But it means you become a target. Doss will try to discredit you, your background, your reasons for being in Harlow Creek, your relationship with Mr. Callahan." A pause. "All of it." The way he said all of it carried a specific weight. Charlotte understood. She thought about the train platform and the women across the street. She thought about Thomas Reed's letters in their brown ribbon. She thought about every person in Harlow Creek who had watched her arrive in a situation and decided what it meant about her before she'd spoken a single word. "Let him try," she said. Hale almost smiled. "Good," he said. "Then let's go." The filing happened at 3 in the afternoon via telegraph to the Territorial Court in Cheyenne, with Hale's firm as counsel of record. Charlotte sat in the telegraph office and listened to the clicks carrying the information eastward, and felt something that was not quite relief. The case wasn't won. It was barely started, but was the specific release of energy that comes when something you've been building finally becomes real. When it moves from the desk into the world. She stepped out of the telegraph office into the afternoon sun and found Nathaniel waiting by the wagon. He looked at her face. "Done," she said. He nodded. A beat passed. "Doss is going to know within the hour," she said. "His bank gets a copy of the filing." "I know," Nathaniel said. "What do you want to do?" He looked at the street for a moment, at the town that had been his town for 14 years, at the buildings he knew by name and by owner, and by the stories attached to each one, at the place where he had built a life, one careful year at a time. "I want to go home," he said, "and do the evening chores, and let Doss figure out his next move on his own time." He looked at her. "And I want you to eat a proper meal tonight because you look like you haven't in a week." Charlotte looked at him. "I had cornbread on Wednesday," she said. "That's not a meal," he said. "Get in the wagon." She got in the wagon. The proper meal turned out to be a beef stew, substantially better than any other beef stew Charlotte had encountered in 25 years of life, which she didn't mention because she suspected Nathaniel would deflect it, the way he deflected all compliments, not with false modesty, but with a genuine disinterest in being credited for things he considered simply the right way to do something. They ate at the kitchen table, which was where they always ate when she stayed past supper. And for a while, neither of them talked about the case, or the filing, or Doss, or what came next. Nathaniel talked about a fence repair he'd done that morning on the south pasture. Charlotte told him about a time her uncle had discovered a 3-year accounting error in his records that had been generating phantom profit, and the particular way the man's face had moved through 5 stages of emotion in 45 seconds when she showed it to him. Nathaniel laughed at that. Not a big laugh. It was never a big laugh with him, but real low. The kind of laugh that a person produces when something has genuinely caught them off guard. Charlotte thought, "I want to make him laugh again." The thought arrived so simply and clearly that it startled her. She looked at her bowl and finished the stew. After supper, he walked her out to the wagon. She drove herself. Now had been for 2 weeks. He'd insisted she learn, and she had learned in one afternoon, because she was stubborn about competence in a way she couldn't always help. And he stood by the wagon with his hands in his pockets, which was a posture she'd never seen on him before. Usually his hands were doing something. The pockets meant he was restraining them from something. "Thursday night," he said. "In the road, I said something." "I remember," Charlotte said. "I've been thinking about it since." "So have I," she said. He looked at her, and Charlotte looked back at him. She thought about what it would be simple to say here, the easy deflection, the practical redirection to the case. The several very logical reasons why this particular conversation was happening at a complicated time and might be better delayed until the situation was resolved. She was good at all of those moves. She was tired of being good at all of those moves. "I think," she said carefully, "that you are the most honest person I've met in my life. And that is a very unsettling thing to encounter when you're not used to it." She paused. "And I think I don't know what to do with someone who stays." "Stays," he repeated. "Who doesn't leave," she said. "Who doesn't decide eventually that I'm too much trouble or too much weight or too much of something and find a reason to be somewhere else?" She looked at him directly. "Every person in my life has eventually found a reason to be somewhere else." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "Charlotte," he said, "I built a ranch and stayed on it for 14 years, in Wyoming, through 4 bad winters and 2 droughts and a cattle sickness that took 30% of my herd in 1879. A pause. "Staying is about the one thing in the world I know how to do." Charlotte breathed. In, out. She did not say anything else. Neither did he. But when she drove back to town that night, she was conscious of something having shifted, not dramatically, not with proclamations or promises, just quietly, the way things shift when 2 people have been honest with each other about something real. She slept that night properly, for the first time in a week. She woke at 6 to the sound of someone knocking at Mrs. Aldridge's front door with considerable urgency. She was dressed and down the stairs before Mrs. Aldridge reached the door. The Pierce boy again, white-faced this time. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "The bank. Dawsey, someone broke into the church last night." The Reverend's study. Charlotte was out the door before he finished. She arrived at the church to find Reverend Miller standing in the doorway of his study with his arms crossed and an expression of controlled fury that sat very strangely on a man whose natural register was quiet. The door lock had been forced. The wooden boxes were still there, the documents still inside, because she had instructed Hale to take the originals with him to the hotel and leave copies in the church. The copies were still in the boxes, but the boxes had been opened, gone through. The papers were disordered in a way that said someone had been looking for something specific and had not found it. Charlotte stood in the middle of the study and looked at the disrupted papers. He'd been looking for the originals, the documents themselves, looking to take them, destroy them, remove the evidence before the subpoena could compel production of his own records. He hadn't found them because Hale had them at the hotel, but he had been here. He had broken into a church. The specific nature of that calculation that Harlan Doss had determined it was worth breaking into a church to stop what was happening told Charlotte something important about how frightened he was. A man who had spent 3 years being very careful was no longer being careful. She picked up the disordered papers and began restoring them to order. Nathaniel arrived 20 minutes later. He came in and looked at the room and then at Charlotte and then at the Reverend. "Is anything missing?" he asked. "No," Charlotte said. "He was looking for the originals. He didn't find them." She continued stacking papers with methodical calm. "But he's told us something. He knows we've identified the cabinet drawer. He knows we know the originals exist. Otherwise, he wouldn't be looking to destroy evidence. He'd let the case play out and trust that we couldn't prove alteration." She looked up. "He broke into this room because he's scared. And he's scared because those originals show exactly what we think they show. We still can't access them legally before the subpoena," Nathaniel said. "No," Charlotte agreed. "Then we wait." "Then we wait," she said, "and we tell Hale immediately, and we add it to the file." She was pulling a sheet of paper from her coat pocket to write the addendum when Nathaniel put his hand on her arm. Gently, she stopped. "Charlotte," he said, "look at me." She looked at him. "Are you all right?" he said. "Not is the case all right. Not are the documents all right. Are you all right?" She thought about it honestly, which was not how she usually answered that question. "No," she said. "Not entirely." He nodded, like that was the right answer, like he'd needed to know it was real. "Okay," he said. "Then we deal with the file and then we deal with the rest. In that order." "In that order," she agreed. They went to find Hale. The week that followed was the longest of Charlotte's life, and also in a way she couldn't fully account for, among the most vivid. The case moved in the grinding mechanical way that legal processes move forms and responses and motions and countermotions, the slow bureaucratic machinery of justice doing its work at a pace entirely indifferent to the urgency of the people inside it. Doss filed a counter motion through Price to dismiss on standing grounds as Hale had predicted. Hale responded. The territorial court requested additional documentation. Charlotte provided it. Doss's attorney from Cheyenne arrived in Harlow Creek, a sharp-faced man named Burwell, who looked at Charlotte the way Price had looked at her, as if her presence in the situation was itself a kind of argument against her. But the town was watching. That was the thing that Charlotte hadn't entirely calculated. A small town, she was learning, was not just a collection of people who talked about each other. It was a collection of people who were watching all the time everything and forming conclusions based on what they saw rather than what they were told. And what they had seen over the past 4 weeks was this: a woman who had arrived in a difficult situation, had sat down and worked, had gone to Greta Holt's daughter's house and sat at her table, had found Walt Greer's fraud and not destroyed him for it, but used his information to go after the larger wrong, had been threatened by Doss and had told his hired man Monday morning and walked away with her head up. The women who had stood at the feed store on the day Charlotte arrived, not all of them, but some had started to look at her differently. She noticed it in small ways. The way conversations paused and restarted when she walked into Millie's rather than simply stopping. The way Mrs. Bremer, who had been the loudest laugher on the platform that first afternoon, and who ran the dressmaker's shop 2 doors from the post office, had said good morning to her on Tuesday, with something in her face that was not quite apology, but was adjacent to acknowledgement. Charlotte did not rush to meet any of it. She said good morning back to Mrs. Bremer and continued to the post office. She was not interested in performances of reconciliation. She was interested in the actual work. But she noticed. And on Thursday, 11 days after the filing, the thing happened that Hale had been waiting for. One of Doss's vendors, the grain supplier from Laramie, who had been charging the inflated prices through the bank-arranged contracts, received a subpoena for his own business records as part of the discovery process. He arrived in Harlow Creek on Thursday afternoon unannounced, walked into the bank and walked out 20 minutes later. Then he walked into Hale's temporary office at the hotel. His name was Joseph Marsh, and he was a stout, uncomfortable-looking man with the specific discomfort of someone who had been doing a thing they knew was wrong, and has just been given the choice between going down for it and making a deal. He made a deal. Charlotte was in the room when Hale took his statement. She sat against the wall with her notebook and wrote down every word in the precise shorthand she'd developed over years of keeping records, and what Joseph Marsh told them was this: Harlan Doss had approached him 3 years ago with a simple proposal. Marsh would supply goods to Doss's referred ranch clients at a marked-up rate. Doss would pocket the difference. In exchange, Marsh's own outstanding loan with the Territorial Bank would be restructured at favorable rates. It was the same mechanism as Walt Greer's arrangement, duplicated across every vendor in the supply chain. Doss hadn't just defrauded the ranchers. He had built an entire parallel economy around the fraud, with its own incentive structure, its own participants, its own mutual dependency, designed to ensure that everyone with knowledge had a reason to stay quiet. And now, 2 of those participants had talked. Hale looked at Charlotte when Marsh finished. "This establishes conspiracy," he said. "Yes," Charlotte said. "This is no longer a civil fraud case." "No," she said. "It's not." Hale picked up his pen. The criminal referral went to the Territorial Sheriff's Office in Cheyenne that afternoon, via Hale's telegraph. The sheriff's office responded within 2 hours, faster than anything else in this process had moved, because a criminal referral naming a bank officer and citing a conspiracy across multiple counties was the kind of thing that moved fast. A deputy sheriff arrived in Harlow Creek by Friday morning. Charlotte watched from the window of the boarding house as Harlan Doss was walked out of the Harlow Creek Territorial Bank at 10:15 in the morning in front of the entire town, with the deputy at his elbow and the keys to the bank in the deputy's other hand. Doss walked with his head up and his expression controlled. At the last moment as he crossed the street, his eyes found Charlotte in the window. She looked back at him steadily. He looked away first. The bank was sealed pending a full audit. Burwell, his Cheyenne attorney, materialized at the bank door within 20 minutes and began what promised to be a very long and expensive legal process of extraction. Price appeared from his office, assessed the situation, and went back inside. Mrs. Aldridge appeared at Charlotte's door at 10:30 with a cup of coffee and the kind of expression a person has when they've witnessed something they'll be talking about for 20 years. "Well," Mrs. Aldridge said. "Well." Charlotte agreed. She took the coffee. She sat down at the small writing table that had been hers since the first morning, and she thought about what had just happened. Not with triumph exactly. It was too important for triumph, had cost too much in too many directions, for too many people for that. But with a specific clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when something that has been built very carefully over a long time finally stands on its own, and you can see the whole shape of it. She thought about the $41 in the back of her Bible. She thought, I haven't counted it recently. I've been too busy. She thought, I'm going to need to think about what comes next. The thought arrived without the particular dread it would have carried 4 weeks ago. 4 weeks ago, what comes next had been an abyss. No plan, no place, no person, nothing behind her that was solid. Now, it was a question which was different. A question had the possibility of an answer. Nathaniel arrived at noon, not with the wagon he'd ridden, which was faster, and he came in still warm from the ride which he went to Mrs. Aldridge's pump to address, before he came to find Charlotte, because he was the kind of person who didn't arrive at other people's spaces dripping with road dust if he could help it. He found her at the writing table with the Bible open on the surface and her hands flat on either side of it. He pulled the other chair over and sat. "The deputy took him at 10:15, Charlotte said. "I heard." He had. The whole town had heard. "The bank audit is going to take months," she said. "Hale says the civil case runs alongside the criminal proceedings. The families may get their land back, some of them. It depends on what the audit finds in terms of actual title transfer records. And my loan, suspended pending audit. You won't owe them a cent until the court rules on the underlying fraud. And if the fraud is established, which it will be, the loan terms get revisited from the beginning at the original rate you verbally agreed to." She paused. 6%, 3 years. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "The ranch is safe," he said. "The ranch is safe," she confirmed. He exhaled, just once, just slightly, the particular exhale of a man releasing something he had been holding in his chest for a very long time. Charlotte watched him. She thought he has been afraid of losing his father's land for 3 years, and he never once let it make him cruel. He never once let it make him turn away from someone standing alone on a platform. She thought, "I don't know what to do with that." She was beginning to think she was going to have to learn. "Charlotte," he said. "Yes." He looked at the Bible on the table, at her hands on either side of it. "What's in the Bible?" "The rest of my money," she said. "What I arrived with." A pause. "It's more now. Mrs. Aldridge's reduced rate, and Hale has agreed on a fee from the case settlement for my analytical work." She looked at the Bible. "I'm not going to have to leave." Something moved through Nathaniel's face, quick, genuine, undisguised, in the specific way that things are undisguised when they arrive before a person can compose them. "Were you thinking about leaving?" he said. "I think about it the way you think about the ground," she said. "Constantly. Because if you don't know whether the ground is solid, you don't put your weight on it. And I didn't know." She looked at him. "I still don't know entirely." He was quiet for a moment. "What would make you know?" he said. It was such a direct question. She thought about everything she didn't know how to receive: the steadiness, the lunches on the table, the hand in the road, the particular way he asked, "Are you all right?" and meant it. She thought about how long she had organized her life around not needing things from people, because needing things gave people power over you, and people with power over you used it. She thought about how that had been a very effective system, until a cowboy on a platform had asked a direct question and she'd answered it honestly, and the whole architecture of the system had begun to crack. "I don't know what would make me know," she said. "I've spent 25 years making sure I never needed to know." He nodded, thinking. Then, "Charlotte, you want to stay, not because you have to, because you want to." It wasn't a question. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "Then stay," he said. "The rest of it." He paused. "The rest of it can work itself out the way things work themselves out, one day at a time, one thing at a time." A beat. "You're good at working things out." Charlotte looked at Nathaniel Callahan across the small writing table in Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house, this man who had carried his father's land for 14 years and kept his promises to his 12-year-old self, and cooked lunch without making it a production. And she felt something settle in her chest that was different from the clarity of a balanced ledger or the satisfaction of a fraud exposed. It was something quieter, more permanent, something that felt for the first time in her life like ground she might actually put her weight on. "One thing at a time," she said. He almost smiled. "Starting with lunch," he said, "because you still eat like someone who's planning to leave." Charlotte almost laughed. She caught it before it fully escaped, but it was close. "One thing at a time," she said again. And outside, across the town, Harlow Creek was doing what small towns do when something large and long buried is finally brought into the light, talking and arguing and rearranging, some people ashamed, and some people vindicated, and some people simply stunned, the whole organism of the place, recalibrating around an absence where Harlan Doss had been. And in the Reverend's study, 70 pages of documented fraud sat in their organized stacks, having done exactly what Charlotte Whitmore had built them to do. And the ground for the first time felt solid beneath her feet. The audit took 11 weeks. Charlotte knew this because she counted them not obsessively, not with the particular dread she might have counted them 6 weeks ago, but with the steady professional attention of someone who was tracking a process she had built and wanted to see completed correctly. She had not built it to be almost right. She had built it to be finished. She was still at Nathaniel's desk every morning. That had not changed. What had changed was the nature of the work, less frantic now, less driven by the clock that Doss had set ticking, more methodical. Hale was coordinating with the territorial court in Cheyenne. The audit team from the court had arrived in Harlow Creek 3 days after Doss's arrest and had spent 6 weeks dismantling the bank's records with the thorough impersonality of people doing a job they had done before in other places, with other names attached to the same scheme. Charlotte had been asked twice formally to assist with interpreting the accounting structure. She had done so both times with the same precision she brought to everything, and the lead auditor, a thin, serious woman named Agnes Park, who had traveled from Denver and who looked at Charlotte's organized document packet on the first meeting with the expression of a person encountering something unexpectedly well made, had said at the end of their second session that in 20 years of forensic accounting work, she had rarely seen a fraud documented as clearly before a formal investigation had even begun. Charlotte had thanked her. She had thought I had very good reason to be thorough. The cabinet drawer marked originals, once the audit team had legal access to it, contained exactly what Charlotte had theorized it would contain. The original draft loan documents. Every one of them. In Doss's own handwriting, with the accurate terms, the terms every family had verbally agreed to, written in clear figures that matched precisely what each family had described in their testimony. He had kept them as insurance, his own protection if the scheme ever needed to be unwound on his terms. Instead, they had become the airtight evidence that closed every gap in Charlotte's analysis. When Hale called her into his temporary office to tell her about the drawer contents, he had put the photographic copies of the originals on the table between them and looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "You were right about everything," he said. Charlotte looked at the documents. She thought about Greta Holt's voice thinning out when she described signing the papers, about the Pierce family's eldest boy working weekends at the telegraph office to help his parents stay afloat, about Nathaniel's exhale when she told him the ranch was safe, just that one exhale, years of fear released in half a second. "I know," she said. It came out flat. Not triumphant, just honest. Hale almost smiled. "The criminal case against Doss will proceed in Cheyenne," he said. "The civil restitution, land recovery, financial damages, those filings are complete. The families should expect rulings within 60 days. He paused. "And your compensation from the settlement fund. I've had it structured as a professional consultation fee. It's not what your work was worth, but it's what the court would approve." He named the figure. Charlotte was quiet for a moment. "That's enough," she said. "To stay." "Yes," Hale said. "It is." She walked out of his office into the Harlow Creek afternoon and stood on the sidewalk in the same place she had stood on the day she'd walked out of Price's office, with his refusal still stinging, and Doss already reaching for his telephone. She stood there and looked at the street, the same buildings, the same town, and she thought about how a place could look identical while everything inside it had shifted. She walked to the post office. She had a letter to write. She had not written to her mother since before she left Columbus. There had been nothing to say that she could say honestly, and dishonest letters required energy she hadn't had. But now she sat at the public writing table in the corner of the post office and wrote 3 pages in her usual even hand, and she told her mother the truth about all of it. Thomas Reed, the platform, the trunk, the cowboy, the desk, the fraud, the filing, the arrest. All of it factual and direct, the way she always told things. At the end of the 3rd page, she wrote, "I am not coming home. I have found work here that is real, and a place where the work matters, and a person who is honest in a way I did not know people could be honest. I am well. I am more well than I have been in longer than I can account for. Please do not worry." She folded the letter. She thought about what her mother would make of it. The particular way her mother's face moved when Charlotte did something that didn't fit the shape her mother had been expecting. The slight tightening, the careful repositioning of expectations. She thought she'll worry anyway. She thought that's all right. She mailed the letter and walked back to the boarding house and went upstairs and sat on her bed and allowed herself, for the first time since she had arrived in Harlow Creek, to do absolutely nothing for a full hour. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the wall and let the last 11 weeks move through her in no particular order. After an hour, she stood up, straightened her dress, and went downstairs to help Mrs. Aldridge with supper. The thing about the town recalibrating, Charlotte learned, was that it happened in pieces rather than all at once. There was no single moment where Harlow Creek turned to face her and said we were wrong, because that was not how towns worked. Instead, it happened the way all real changes happened, in small, specific, unrepeatable moments, each one accumulating until the overall picture was different from what it had been. Mrs. Bremer came to Charlotte in the 3rd week after the arrest and asked, with the effortful directness of a woman making herself do something uncomfortable, whether Charlotte might be willing to look at the dressmaker shop's accounts. She had not been managing them properly, and she suspected she was losing money in places she couldn't identify. Charlotte looked at her. She thought about the platform, about covered mouths and laughter. "Yes," she said, "I can do that." She did not make it easy for Mrs. Bremer in the way that would have required Mrs. Bremer to say nothing about what had passed between them. But she did the work cleanly and well, and when she found the error, a consistent miscalculation in the fabric cost allocation that had been costing Mrs. Bremer 15% of her margins for 2 years. She explained it clearly and without condescension, and Mrs. Bremer listened with the attentiveness of someone who was receiving 2 things simultaneously and understood the value of both. When Charlotte left, Mrs. Bremer said, "Miss Whitmore, I'm sorry, for the platform." Charlotte stopped. She turned. "I know," she said. It was not forgiveness exactly, but it was acknowledgement. And acknowledgement, Charlotte had decided, was the honest thing, more honest than the warm absolution that the other person wanted, which would have required her to say it didn't matter when it had. Mrs. Bremer nodded, and that was that. Walt Greer came to her 2 days later with a referral. A rancher from 12 miles north of town who'd heard about the Doss case and wanted his accounts reviewed by someone who knew how to find things that were supposed to stay hidden. Charlotte took the referral. She took the 2 that followed. By the 6th week after the arrest, she had 4 regular clients in Harlow Creek and 2 inquiry letters from Cheyenne, where word of her work on the Doss case had moved through the legal community with the speed that competent, well-documented work tended to move when the right people were paying attention. She was building something. She could feel it taking shape the way she could feel the shape of an argument in a set of numbers not finished yet, not certain yet, but structured, directional, real. At Nathaniel's ranch, the work continued too, just with a different character now. She still came every morning. She still sat at the desk. But the urgency had dissolved into something more sustainable, the regular rhythm of a business being run properly with someone watching the numbers who knew what they were doing. The cattle were healthy. The supply contracts had been renegotiated, directly cutting out every one of Doss's kickback vendors and replacing them with fair-priced suppliers that Charlotte had identified through Agnes Park's contacts in Denver. The ranch's financial picture, for the first time in 3 years, was improving. Nathaniel didn't say much about it. He was not a man who said much about things that were working, but Charlotte had learned to read the particular quality of his silence, and the silence around the ranch these weeks had a different texture than the silence that had been there when she arrived, less weight in it. Less of that specific heaviness that financial fear put into the air of a place. One Tuesday morning in the 7th week, she arrived at the ranch to find a second chair had been moved to the desk from the front room. Not the chair that was already there, Nathaniel's chair, the one he used when he sat across from her. A third chair, a good one with a straight back and a cushion positioned beside the desk rather than across it. She looked at it. She looked at Nathaniel, who was making coffee in the kitchen, and who had his back to her and his attention apparently entirely on the coffee. "That chair," she said. "Needed somewhere to put it. he said. Front room was crowded. Your front room has 4 pieces of furniture in it. Crowded, he said again, and brought her the coffee. She looked at the chair. She looked at him. He looked at the window. She sat down at the desk. She did not move the chair. It stayed there. The letter from the territorial court arrived on a Wednesday in the 9th week, and Charlotte was the one who received it because she was at the ranch when the mail came, and Nathaniel was in the South Field. She opened it. She was authorized to open all correspondence pertaining to the case per the document Hale had filed, establishing her role, and she read it standing in the front room with the morning light coming through the east window. She read it twice. She walked to the South Field. Nathaniel was mending a section of fence that had been troubling him for a week, working with the patient, competent efficiency of a man who fixed things the first time correctly rather than quickly. He heard her coming and straightened, looking at her face. He put down the wire. Tell me, he said. The Holts are getting the land back, she said. Full restoration of title. Same for the Beaumonts. The Pierce's case is slightly more complicated because Doss had transferred part of their land to a holding company, but Hale says the court will pierce that within 30 days. She looked at the letter in her hands. Your loan has been declared void. The original terms, 6% 3 years, are being honored by the court-appointed bank trustee. And Doss is being transported to Cheyenne for trial next month. Nathaniel was very still. The field was quiet around them. The cattle moved somewhere in the distance. A bird crossed overhead. The ordinary sounds of a working ranch going about its morning. Greta Holt gets her land back, he said. Yes. He looked at the fence line. The one his father had built first, the marker on the east side. All right, he said. His voice was rough at the edges, just slightly, just enough to hear. Charlotte looked at him. She thought about a 12-year-old boy who had watched his mother stand alone and had decided something permanent about himself in that moment. She thought about how that decision had shaped everything. The ranch, the patients, the chair moved from the front room. All of it downstream from one moment a boy had decided who he was going to be. She thought, I don't deserve this man. Then she thought, no. That's the old thinking. That's the thinking I came here with. She thought instead, I am going to try to deserve this man. I am going to work at it the same way I work at everything. Nathaniel, she said. He looked at her. I want to talk about the chair, she said. Something moved in his face. The chair. The one you moved to the desk. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with the direct, unhurried steadiness that she had come to understand was not distance, was never distance, was actually the closest attention she had ever been paid by any person in her life. What about it, he said. I think you should say what you mean, she said. Because I've learned in the time I've been here that you don't do things without meaning them, and I'd rather you say it directly than let me interpret furniture. His jaw moved. Not quite a smile. Something deeper. Fair, he said. He picked up his hat from the fence post and turned it once in his hands. I moved that chair, he said, because I'm tired of sitting across the desk from you, because across feels like the wrong direction. He paused. And because I want you to stay at this ranch, not because it's where your work is, but because you want to be here, because this place... He stopped. Because when you're in it, it's different. And I've been alone in it for 8 years and I know the difference. Charlotte looked at him across the fence post and the worn wire and the Wyoming morning. I'm not a simple situation, she said. I'm not looking for simple, he said. I have opinions about everything, and I will tell you when I think you're wrong. I expect that, he said. I'd be suspicious if you didn't. And I'm... She stopped, made herself say it. I know what I look like to people. I know how I arrive in a room. And I know this town laughed at me on a platform 6 weeks ago, and you're a man who has to live in this town. Charlotte. His voice was quiet and absolutely certain. I don't care what this town thinks about who I choose. I never have. A beat. And anyone in Harlow Creek who wants to have an opinion about it can bring that opinion directly to me. She thought about Mrs. Bremer, about the covered mouths on the platform. About every room she had ever walked into, knowing she would be assessed before she spoke a word. She thought about Nathaniel Callahan on a horse, almost keeping riding, choosing not to. "One thing at a time," she said. "One thing at a time," he agreed. "Starting with, finishing this fence," he said. "And then lunch. And then you can tell me I'm doing the accounts wrong again." "You are doing the accounts wrong," she said. "You've been putting the feed costs in the wrong column for 3 weeks." "I know," he said. "I do it on purpose, so you have something to correct." Charlotte stared at him. He picked up the wire. She turned and walked back toward the house, and she was almost there before she let herself laugh. Really laugh fully. The kind of laugh that comes from somewhere genuine and doesn't ask permission. And she stood in the morning air of the Callahan Ranch and let it happen. It felt like the best thing. The trial of Harlan Doss took place in Cheyenne in the 11th week. Charlotte was not required to attend. Her documentation spoke clearly enough without her. But she went anyway because she had built the case, and she intended to see it finished, and because Greta Holt asked if she would come and sit with her. And Charlotte found she could not say no to that. She and Greta and Nathaniel rode the train to Cheyenne together, which was the first time Charlotte had been on a train since arriving in Wyoming, and which had a particular weight to it that she did not examine too closely until they were moving, and the station was behind them, and she was watching the Wyoming plain open up on either side. Greta reached over and put her hand over Charlotte's. Charlotte looked at the older woman. "I know," Greta said simply. She did not specify what she knew. She did not need to. Charlotte turned her hand over and held Greta's in return. Nathaniel, sitting across from them, looked out the window and said nothing, which was the right thing. The trial lasted 3 days. Edmund Hale presented the case with the same precise, unhurried clarity that Charlotte had seen him bring to everything. And the original draft documents, the ones from the cabinet drawer in Doss's own handwriting, bearing terms that matched every family's verbal testimony, exactly what Charlotte had known they would do when she first heard Nathaniel describe seeing that drawer label from across the bank office. They made the case undeniable. Doss's attorney Burwell fought well, but he was fighting the mathematics, and mathematics did not negotiate. The figures were the figures, the dates were the dates, the pattern was the pattern. On the 3rd day, the jury returned in 40 minutes. Guilty, on all counts. Greta Holt covered her face with both hands and made a sound that was not quite crying, was something older and deeper than crying, the sound of a person who has been holding a weight for a very long time, finally being told they can set it down. Charlotte kept her own face forward. She thought about $41 folded in the back of a Bible. She thought about a direct question asked plainly on a train platform. She thought that was the beginning of this. That one honest question asked by someone who almost kept writing and didn't. Harlan Doss was sentenced to 14 years in the Territorial Penitentiary. Charlotte looked at him as the sentence was read, looked at the smooth confidence and the fine suit and the particular quality of practiced pleasantness that had allowed him to sit across from frightened people and take everything they had. She watched his face when the sentence came down, watched the thing that moved through it. Not remorse. She didn't think it was remorse, but a kind of final recalculation, the last adjustment of a man who had spent 3 years believing he had built something unassailable and had just been shown the specific point where it had cracked. It had cracked at a train station, on a summer afternoon, in front of a woman sitting on a wooden trunk with $41 and 6 months of letters tied with brown ribbon. He had not accounted for her. That was his error. She looked away from him. She was done looking at him. They rode the train back to Harlow Creek the next morning, and this time Charlotte sat next to the window and watched the plane go past with the particular quality of attention she gave to things she was deciding how to feel about. Greta slept most of the way, her head tilted against the window glass, looking older and softer in sleep than she did awake. Nathaniel read a newspaper for the first hour and then set it down and looked at Charlotte. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. "It's done." "Yes." He looked at her for a moment. "How does it feel?" She thought about this honestly. "Like a ledger that finally balances," she said. You know it's right, but the relief is quieter than you expected, because the work was so loud, and the finishing is just—" She paused. "Just the number being correct, which it should have been all along. And now I have 4 clients in Harlow Creek and 2 inquiry letters from Cheyenne," she said, "and a chair next to a desk that I have not moved." She looked at him. "And I have been thinking about what you said in the South Field." Nathaniel folded the newspaper. "And," he said. The train was loud around them. The plain was wide outside the window. "And I want to stay," she said. "Not because I have nowhere else to go. Not because the work is here. Because I—" She stopped, made herself continue. "Because I want the ranch in the morning, and the lunch on the table, and the chair next to the desk." She looked at him directly. "And I want the person who put the chair there." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. "Charlotte," he said. "Yes, I'm going to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to answer me the same way you answer everything directly, without managing me. All right. Will you marry me?" The train moved. The plane was enormous outside the glass. Greta slept. Charlotte looked at Nathaniel Callahan. She thought about everything that had led to this moment: the letters tied with brown ribbon, the platform, the trunk, the direct question asked plainly, the desk, the work, the fraud, the fear, the hand in the road, the chair beside the desk. She thought about the 12-year-old boy who had made a promise and the man who had kept it every day since. She thought, "I came here with nothing and built something real." She thought, "No. We built something real." "Yes," she said. He reached over and took her hand. He held it the way he held everything he intended to keep carefully, without flourish, with the complete and unhurried attention of a man who understood that the things worth holding required both hands and no reservations. Greta woke up 20 minutes outside of Harlow Creek and looked at their joined hands and said nothing at all, just pressed her lips together in the specific way of a woman who has seen something good and intends to let it be good without commentary. Charlotte caught her eye. Greta patted her own heart once deliberately. Charlotte understood. The train pulled into Harlow Creek at 3 in the afternoon on a Thursday, 11 weeks and 4 days after Charlotte Whitmore had arrived on a different train with a bundle of letters and a situation that the whole town had watched with laughter and satisfaction, and the comfortable certainty that they knew exactly what kind of woman she was and exactly what her story meant. The platform was quiet when they stepped off, but not empty. Mrs. Aldridge was there, and Reverend Miller and his wife, and the Pierce family, all 6 of them, and old Greta Holt's daughter, who had come to receive her mother, and Walt Greer standing slightly apart in the particular posture of a man who was not certain of his welcome, and had come anyway, which Charlotte decided was worth something, and Mrs. Bremer standing at the edge of the small gathered group with her hands folded and her chin up, and an expression that was trying very hard to be dignified about the fact that it was moved. Charlotte stepped onto the platform. She stood in the same place she had sat on the trunk, almost exactly the same place she thought, near the post where Nathaniel had tied his horse, and she looked at the people who had gathered. She thought about the woman who had sat here 11 weeks ago, holding herself together with both hands, not crying, not breaking, waiting for someone who was never going to come. She thought that woman did not know what she was about to do. She thought, "I'm glad she held on." Mrs. Aldridge came forward first, took Charlotte's hand in both of hers, and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying, and she had always known the difference. Reverend Miller shook Nathaniel's hand and looked between the two of them with the slow, thoughtful assessment of a man who reads people carefully. "Well," the Reverend said, "I take it things went well in Cheyenne." 14 years, Nathaniel said. The Reverend nodded. He looked at Charlotte. "And beyond the verdict." Charlotte looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel was looking at her with the particular expression she had come to understand was as close as he came to wearing his heart on the outside. Not dramatic, not declarative, just entirely present, entirely certain, entirely his. "That too," Charlotte said. The Reverend smiled. His wife made a small sound of satisfaction. Greta Holt's daughter appeared and took her mother by both hands, and Charlotte watched the older woman's face change in the way faces change when they are with someone who loves them, the careful control giving way to something softer and less armored. And she thought, that is what it looks like. To be held by someone who has always been yours. She thought, I am going to learn what that looks like from the inside. That evening, for the first time, Charlotte sat at the table in Nathaniel's kitchen, not as someone who was staying for supper, but as someone who lived there. Not officially, not yet. Not in the formal sense that required a reverend and a Sunday, and the whole town watching which was coming, she understood in its own time. But in the internal sense, the one that mattered more. She sat at the table, and it was her table. She handed him the bread, and it was her bread to hand. She looked at the room, and it was her room to look at. Nathaniel sat across from her. He said, the south fence. She said, what about it? He said, I've been meaning to replace the whole eastern run. But it's going to take 2 weeks, and I'll need, she said, I can work the accounts in the morning and ride out in the afternoons. He said, you don't have to do that. She said, I know I don't have to. He looked at her. She looked at him. Good, he said. She picked up her fork. The ranch was quiet around them. The summer evening was long. Outside, the Wyoming plain went on in every direction, farther than a person could walk in a day, enormous and unhurried, and absolutely indifferent to the specific human business happening at the kitchen table inside the house on the Callahan land, the business of two people who had found each other in an unlikely way, through a fraud and a platform and a direct question asked at the right moment, and had chosen with full awareness of what they were choosing to stay. Charlotte ate her supper. She thought about the letters tied with brown ribbon, which were still in the tin box in the bottom of her trunk. She had not looked at them since arriving. She thought about whether she would keep them or let them go. She thought about the specific usefulness of keeping things that had hurt you versus the specific usefulness of setting them down. She decided she would decide later. Right now she had supper in front of her and a ranch around her and the man across the table who had not once in 11 weeks found a reason to be somewhere else. She thought, I came here with nothing. She thought I was wrong about that. She had come here with everything she needed. She just hadn't known it yet. Outside, the evening settled over Harlow Creek, Wyoming, with the slow, unhurried permanence of summer becoming something else. Not ending, just changing the way all real things changed. The same town, the same plain, the same enormous sky. But everything inside it different from what it had been. Because sometimes life does not give you the thing you traveled hundreds of miles to find. Sometimes it gives you something truer. A question asked plainly. A hand on a trunk. A chair moved beside